Hello, everyone. Welcome to day two of Debate Dojo. We hope that you had a wonderful sleep last night because today we will have a different set of lectures. So, before anything else, I'll just make some announcements. As per the email blast and Discord announcement, the AM and PM sessions will be flipped. So, instead of having the core debate, common debate frames, and current matter per selected motion theme, this morning we will have them in the afternoon. And in the morning, we will have the deputy speech structure, closing strategies, and member speech structure, and reply speech structure as well. So another announcement is that the PM session has been pushed back a bit by an hour because of some scheduling conflicts. So it will start at 2:30 p.m. and will end at 5:30 p.m. So I hope that's noted. Kindly inform your instimates if you have any who are participating as well about the changes. And also all these changes are also announced in the Discord and in the email blast as well. So with that said, oh, one person is entering. Okay, so I'd like to introduce to you our guest lecturer.
Oh, hello, guys. I think Verse got disconnected. Let's just give her a bit of time and then we'll be back. Hi, guys. Verse is rejoining right now. Let's just give her a bit, like a few minutes.
Hello, everybody. I apologize for that hiccup. I seem to have a bit of a technical issue, but all is well now. Can you give me co-host access? Thank you.
Oh, hold on. I think it got disconnected again. Just hang on a second.
Anyway, so there seems to be something weird going on with my laptop, so I'll just use Let's Laptop instead. I'm here to introduce our guest lecturer for this morning. So she is the grand champion and third best speaker of Seri Iskandar Debate Open 2022. And she's also an Asian double octa finalist in the United Nations Debating Championship, the Asian AP Major in 2022, as well as the Asian partial double octa finalist in the same tournament in its 2021 edition. She's also a national octa finalist in the National Debate Championship 2022 and national quarter finalist, as well as the 12th ranking team in the Philippines in the Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship 2021. So, to talk about a lot of very wonderful topics this morning, I'm inviting my friend and my longtime debate partner, Charlotte Hinao, onto the floor. Let's.
Hi, guys. Um, we're very lucky that we are in the same place right now because um, we would have not been able to work on the technical difficulties had this happened. But anyway, hi everyone. It's nice to see you guys again. I mean, nice to see you guys for the first time for a lot of you here. Um, I'm very honored to have been invited by Verse as one of the guest lecturer of this debate dojo. And like Verse said, we have been longtime partners ever since we were in college. So a lot of the things that Verse has taught you yesterday are things that we learned together as we were partners during our time in debate. And the things that I will be teaching you all today are also the things that I learned personally and the things that worked for me personally when I was competitively debating in college with Verse as well. So this is going to be the flow of my lectures, and I think you're already familiar with the flow because of the program that Verse gave to you. But the first lecture that I will be providing is going to be on deputy speeches. And then after that will be about closing strategies or member speeches. And the large reason for that is because when I was debating during college, my role most of the time was I was the deputy speaker and also the member speaker. So that's also why Verse asked me to be the one to give this lecture. And then after my lectures on deputy and member, the next thing that I will talk about is it's going to shift to a different format. We're going to talk about Asian parliamentary reply speeches. So I also was the one often providing the reply speeches when we would join Asian parliamentary debate competitions. So I will be just sharing to you guys the strategies that I often took and often like employed during my speeches before. So without further ado, I think we can begin. So just give me a moment to share my screen and present to you whatever I have, and hopefully you guys can learn a thing or two from me today. So I'm also very excited. And also, if you guys have any questions in the middle of the discussion, please feel free to message them in the chat. And we can definitely address that maybe in the middle of the lecture or perhaps after the lecture as well. So let's begin. Okay, there we go. Okay. Um, Zoom tells me that my screen is now visible, but I would like to double check with you guys. So can one of you just tell me if you can see the screen? Maybe just say it in the chat, or maybe just a
The
like
screen is
button.
visible po.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks so much for the acknowledgement. All right, let's begin. So I'm not sure if any of you have particular roles already when it comes to debating with if you have like a long time partner already and all that stuff. But for those of you who have experienced becoming a deputy speaker or perhaps even a member speaker, I would completely understand why there's a lot of fear involved in them. And the reason for this is because for those speakers who do deputy speeches and member speeches at closing, they're usually the ones in the middle of the round, right? Meaning, if we're gonna look at debate as a sandwich, you are the palaman, you're the one in the middle. And there's a lot of pivoting that you have to do. There's a lot of adjusting and shifting that you have to do as deputy and as member. And oftentimes we feel like these are the speeches that have little to no prep time. So, for example, if you're a first speaker, like if you're prime minister or leader of opposition, you may be the first speaker, and maybe that has its own like fears attached to it to them as well. But the the one thing that people like about it is that you had the whole 15 minutes of British parliamentary prep time to think about what your arguments will be. Unlike if you are deputy, you kind of don't have that luxury, right? So that's also the reason why lots of people are scared of becoming the second speaker in the opening half. And similarly with member speeches, a lot of people are very scared to be the member. And that's because, especially during times when your opening is really, really good, and we have extensively discussed lots of material in the debate, usually the member speaker feels that sort of panic like, what am I going to do? Or what am I going to say? They already said all of our arguments. So there's a lot of fear involved in these two speeches. And I myself have had my fair share of those panicky moments and fearful moments where I feel like I have nothing to say in these positions. But that's also precisely why I want to share what I've learned in my many years of debating and how to ace these positions and in how to work on um, minimizing the panic and that fear. And not just working on that, but more on loving these positions um, and at the end of the day, because once you are able to deliver really good deputy and member speeches, you will feel like you can do anything. Like it feels so empowering. And that's why I would like to give, some pieces of advice on how to work on these speeches and how to end up loving them as a position as well. So let's first talk about the commonalities or the similarities between the deputy and the member. For a lot of like pairings in debate or in British parliamentary debating, some people are usually just the first speaker in the opening half and also the first speaker in the closing half. That's usually the kind of like match that I see when it partners, right? But um at least for me during my time as a debater, um I was both like I was doing the position for the one in the middle of the debate. So that's the deputy and the member. So some people might find it weird, like, oh, isn't that kind of weird that you're a second speaker in the opening and the first speaker for closing? But the thing is, I would personally say that there's a lot of similarities between these two positions that um make it also work if you're going to take these positions in British parliamentary, whether you're opening or closing. So some of the commonalities include the following. Number one, the need for extremely high round consciousness. So disclaimer, that doesn't mean that if you're a prime minister or leader of opposition or if you're a whip, you're exempt from having high round consciousness. But I would say, if you're a deputy speaker or a member speaker, um, the level of round consciousness that you're supposed to have has a different nuance to it. And it's quite intense, it's quite high in a sense that you are the one in the middle, you are the one who needs to have um, very, very quick level of adjustment. And if you are not highly conscious of what's happening from speaker to speaker, what is the dynamic of the debate in every round, then it's going to be quite difficult for you. So that's the responsibility of and a member as well, to make sure to have that kind of round consciousness throughout the debate. So from first speaker, second speaker, and even until the end of the debate, you have to be able to make sense of what is happening in the debate in your mind, because that's what's going to inform how your speech is going to go. So that's number one. Number two, there's a very, very high burden to adjust and re strategize. So I also mentioned this earlier in terms of high round consciousness, and that's the reason why. And the reason is because number one, the deputy in their role in the opening half is to seal the deal on opening. One of the most difficult things to win in opening for BP debates is to make sure that you've had a lasting impact on the judge. Because you know that you are not the last speaker of the entire debate. There's going to be more speakers after you, and they have, somehow it feels like they somehow have more power over you because they are able to speak after you. So if you are a deputy, your responsibility is to have that lasting impact and be able to seal that deal, even if there will be next people who will talk after you. So that's why you have a high burden to adjust, you have a high burden to re-strategize. But if you are a member, you do have the same burden to do that, except your responsibility is to provide an identity for the team after the openings have spoken. So, opening teams rather. So, let's say you have a really, really good set of opening government and opening opposition, you have really, really good opponents who were able to establish such solid arguments, then it's also quite hard for members to come in and give that, refreshing speech to the judge and make them feel like you are somebody else. You're not just like your opening, you have a different identity compared to them. So that's why, in terms of adjusting and re-strategizing, these two um, positions are quite known for that, or like you have to be good at that kind of skill for you to um, end up having a good chance at winning the debate. So, and that because of that, what you do is you're doing a lot of mid-round work. Um, Compared, for example, to prime minister and leader of opposition, they're mostly going to deliver the speech that was agreed upon during prep. Of course, not all the time that's what happens. PM and LO still always need to re-strategize and also to um, like talk to make sure that they are still highly round conscious in the debate. But they are the first people who are going to speak. They are the frontliners, and that's why, in terms of middle round work, they don't have as much role compared to the deputy and the member, because they're the ones like trying to navigate the whole thing in order for it to go the direction, for the debate to go to the direction that they want it to go. And then the last commonality between the deputy and the member is that they both provide extensions or something new debate. So there's a difference in the type of extensions that you provide in deputy and the type of extensions that you provide as a member. But if we look at it as a whole, their role in like if the basic like role that they have is to provide something new to the debate. So maybe that's also why that worked for me, because of these commonalities in terms of skill. And I probably found out that these are my strengths compared to the strengths needed for a prime minister and the whip. And as I said earlier, these are the things and the tips that I'm going to be sharing to you as someone who's like done deputy and member speeches for so long that it's like it was at some point um it was like what's breathing is like for me. Anyway, let's start with deputy speeches first. And let's talk about the opening half for now. So, what the role is of the second speaker when you are the opening half. So, again, a lot of fears attached to being the opening half is we are the group with a lesser prep time. How are we going to give a lasting impact? And since you are the deputy, you are the last speaker, or basically the last, like, like savior of your team. Not really savior, because your partner will do their own job as well. But for example, if you had a really, really good um rebuttal from your opponent at opening, you're the last person who has the final say for your team, because your first speaker will not be able to give a speech anymore. You're the last person to give the speech. So I'm going to tell you what are the strategies and the possible possible tips that you can take during prep, in the middle of the round, and also like after the debate, right? So let's talk about the prep roles for deputy first. And again, disclaimer, this isn't to say that this is the completely right way to do things. Many people have their own style, but this is what worked for us when we were doing this, when we were doing debate as partners as well. So during prep, deputies have very, very important roles. So when I was a beginner debater, like many years ago, I used to think that if you're a deputy in prep, um, you're kind of chill, because the prime minister or the leader of opposition will be thinking of their own arguments, and then I'll just think of my own as well and all that stuff. But that's not correct. That's wrong. Deputies should not. just be chilling during prep just because they're the second speaker. But also, they should not be individualistic in a sense that they shouldn't be working on their own speech only, and the PM or LO shouldn't be working alone as well. So, one of the things that I noticed among students that I've had when it comes to debate is that if they prepped for opening, they don't talk to each other. And that is a problem because that will translate in the speech that you're going to provide once you're already in the round. So the most important thing at prep is to talk to each other. But for a deputy, the following are the things that I would advise you guys to do while you are prepping with your first speaker. So, number one, your role as deputy is to guide and help your first speaker build the intuitive case during most of the prep time. So, meaning you have to be a leader. Not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that your partner shouldn't be able to lead as well. You guys can lead each other during prep, but you have to accept the role that you should initiate the conversation. You should guide and help navigate prep time, especially since your first speaker is likely to be the one who is less distant to the round. Since they're the first speaker, they have their thought that, okay, I need to give a speech and I need to be prepared for my speech since they're the first speakers, right? And since you have a bit more distance from the round by virtue of the fact that you're a second speaker, that means you probably have a different perspective that you can provide. You don't have that sort of panicky feeling that you're going to be speaking first and all that. So you have the ability and even the luxury of like a headspace to do the leading of prep. So if your partner is unable to lead prep, and perhaps understandably so because they're way too focused on giving that speech, then just step up and help them build that case. So if you're deputy, you have no excuse to just be quiet and let them write their own speech. You have to talk to each other and you have to be the one helping them strategize. So that's number one. And I said here that you have to help them build the intuitive case during most of the prep time, but not all of the prep time. And the reason for that is because um, you should also have time for yourself. So these numbers that I'm going to show you, that I shown here on the screen, are not fixed. That's something I want to give as a disclaimer as well. But ideally, after around 12 minutes of your prep, you should start focusing on your extension. So it's understandable if we use most of prep time to build the case of the first speaker because that's where you're going to lay down all of the intuitive cases, the most needed like arguments for the debate. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have time for yourself because the deputy's speech is also as important as the first speaker's speech. So you should have at least around like not at least but sometime around 3 minutes to think of what you're going to say as the second speaker. And very importantly, make sure that you come into an agreement with the first speaker as to what you are going to run, even if it's just a general idea. So, in the last 3 minutes, you might be wondering, I don't think that's enough for me to make a whole speech for myself. That's because you don't need to make your whole speech in just 3 minutes. Um, you just need to have a general idea of what you are going to run. And very important, again, you have to come to an agreement with your first speaker that just tell them explicitly that, hey, what if we run this at deputy? Or maybe your first speaker can be the one to give you a suggestion. Maybe you can run this. And this is why it's aligned with my speech. So having that kind of agreement with your first speaker is going to be good because you can trust each other that this is what you're going to talk about. But secondly, you know that whatever's going to come out of your speech is aligned with the speech of your first speaker. Because imagine if you guys didn't talk to each other for at least, around 3 minutes about what the extension will be. Number one, the deputy will be at a disadvantage. If the whole prep time was only dedicated to PM and LO, deputy will be left alone to think of their arguments in just a few minutes in the middle of the round, and that's not gonna be fair. So it's also important that you try to urge your first speaker to give you some help in the last 3 minutes of prep, because that's also their role for you as well. If you give them that much help as in the first 12 minutes, they should also try to help you back, and that's how teamwork in debate works, right? So that's what could happen. But secondly, if you don't agree with each other, you might end up running something that's completely like led astray from what your original case was. Um and if there's no agreement between the two of you, it might cause things like contradictions, inconsistencies in the debate or in among the team, and we would very much like to avoid that if we want to win on opening, right? So always force yourselves to be able to have that agreement even at the last part of prep. One of the common problems that a lot of debaters experience is that they don't get to talk about the deputy speech anymore. But please see the value in it and try to really convince yourselves that this is how we can win. We need to be aligned. We need to help each other. And then um, uh, the note that I put here is that always try to force yourselves to follow a type of prep dynamic that still provides room for deputy. And the tip that I have is do constant case building with your partners, with your teammates in debate. So I know maybe some of you have like established partners already, the very same person that you go to tournaments with. So one of the ways for you to have that established prep dynamic is to keep case building so that um it's like instinct to you already that okay, it's already 12 minutes, it's your turn, it's time for us to think of arguments for you. It's already going to be instinctual instead of you forcing yourselves to do it. Case building is important. But even if you don't have an established partner, it's still very good to start building prep dynamics with various partners. Maybe there's many people in your debate university, um, or you just have a lot of people you want to debate with, and maybe each of them have different prep styles. But it's important that in all those prep experiences that you have as a deputy, you have room for yourself. Okay, so establish that kind of dynamic with the people you partner up with, and your prep as deputy will go very smoothly. So that's the first few tips that I have for prep time during for a deputy speaker. Now let's talk about mid-round strategies. And I think this is the part of the lecture that is quite heavy when it comes to deputy because again, as I said in the first part of this lecture, deputies have a lot of mid-round work to do. So let's go through them one by one and I'll try my best to make it a simple explanation for everybody to understand. So after prep time, you only have either 14 or 21 minutes to do so many things. You have 14 minutes if you are a DPM, if you have 21 minutes if you are DLO. And in those 14 and 21 minutes during the speeches of everybody else in opening half, you have to do so many things. Number one, you have to listen to your partner's speech and look for the gaps that you need to fill. Because let's be honest, there's no like absolutely perfect debate speech. Sometimes whatever was prepped doesn't necessarily 100% translate to the speech itself. Or maybe your partner was not able to manage their time in the most ideal way possible, and that made them unable to provide maybe the middle analysis of their argument, maybe the impacts of their argument, or maybe the necessary conclusions that needed to be explicitly said in their speech. So, as a deputy, in the 14 or 21 minutes that you have in the middle of the round, you have to be able to listen carefully to what those gaps are. So you are here to think of what are certain holes that you need to fill, or what are additional analyses that you can provide to strengthen the already good speech that was given by your partner. So that's one out of four things that you need to do at the same time in 14 to, or 21 minutes. The second thing that you need to do simultaneously is to build your own extension. So that's in it's a completely different skill needed as well, because the first skill and the first point that we talked about is you need to be a good listener. You need to be a good um you need to be good at comprehension, because that's how you identify where you're gonna come in, right? But the second thing that you need to do at the same time is to build your own extension. So you need to do your own critical thinking for yourself with the guidance of your partner during prep, of course, because that's the point of the last 3 minutes, right? But after the last 3 minutes of you guys talking about what your general idea to run is, you are going to be kind of on your own at that moment when it comes to building your own extension. You have to be able to identify the levels of your argument. You need to be able to identify what the impacts of your argument are, what are the conclusions, and all of that stuff as well. And you have to do that at the same time with the other roles that you have during the middle of the round. Thirdly, you also need to listen to your opponent's speeches and think of rebuttal. So another listening skill needed here. Um, so perhaps a similar skill to the point number one, because it's listening, it's comprehension, it's looking for what you need to criticize, it's looking for um, how you're going to destroy your opponent's arguments, right? So similar skill, but different nuance, because this time it's your opponent. This time you are going against them. So the first listening skill that you needed here is to think of how you can add to your partner and how you can fill the gaps. But the next listening skill needed here is more on how you can convince the judges that what your opponent is saying is wrong or untrue. So those are two completely different things to think about as well, while thinking about your own extension too. And lastly, you also need to provide material that would guard your team from the closing half. So this is exactly why I'm saying that mid-round consciousness is so important, because you need to think about the whole debate in itself. You have to think about what your partner is saying. You have to think about what your opponent is saying in their speech. You have to think about what has not yet been said by your closing, but you have to guard yourself from it so that they cannot win over you. So, all those four different things, you need to be able to balance them and do them all together in just 14 or 21 minutes. And that's the reason why a lot of people end up panicking at deputy. That's also why I panicked at first when I was taking on this role. But there's a strategy on how you can try to balance all of these things together in the few minutes that you have. And um, that also has to do with time management and being able to prioritize which one to do first. So it's much like I'm sure you guys are all students, and you've had your fair share of having way too much homework and way too much projects to do for school, and you just need to prioritize. So it's something like that. If there's anything you can relate to, it's something like that. It's just the skill of being able to do which one first, so that you don't end up panicking. It's all about organizational skills as well. So what could be your mid-round strategy as them? So, number one, try to be structured and do not panic. I know that do not panic is so much easier said than done, but you not panicking will be an effect of your efforts to be structured. So, structure is very important, not just in your speech, but in your way of thinking. So, meaning you have to be able to have a mental structure on how you're going to prioritize all your goals in your few minutes. So, more specifically, here's what I would recommend that you guys can do in your few minutes of like prep time. So, if you're a deputy, of course, there's a time that your partner is going to speak, right? So let's say your partner has started speaking. They already have 7 minutes to themselves. What should I do? Should I build my extension during my partner's speech? Should I um, think of what the opponent will say during my partner's speech? So my recommendation for this is focus on building your extension when your partner is speaking. It's very important to do this because, especially if you trust your partner, they are likely to deliver most of what has been prepared during 15 minutes anyway. And you can trust them to do that because you were able to help them build your first few arguments, your setup for the debate. So when your partner has started speaking, think for yourself. Start thinking, what am I going to say this time? However, it's still very important to listen to your speech while focusing on building on your extension. From time to time, type down what you think is lacking from your partner's speech. Maybe you could put it somewhere in your intro on the first part of your speech so that you can rebuild for them. Say, for example, your partner kind of missed like an impact to mention in their speech. So maybe your intro could be creatively spun in a way that hints that these are the impacts of their argument. So something like that. That's why you need to be able to strike a balance on focusing your building on building your extension, but still being very multitasky. Like you have to have good multitasking skills in the sense that you're still able to figure out what their gaps are. And I trust that you will have a good skill in that because you already know what was supposed to be appearing in their speech, and you would have an idea what has not yet appeared in their speech. That's why you can insert that somewhere in the first part of your introduction just to um be able to clear that path, right? So that's what you can do when your partner is. So now let's pretend that your partner is finished speaking. You've had a bit of rebuilding that you were able to place in your intro, and you were also able to give a structure to your own arguments already. You were already able to build it. This time, it's your opponent's turn to speak. Now, what you do is to focus on your rebuttals. Very important to be very skeptical and listen very carefully to what your opponent is missing, what your opponent said wrong, what is their frame, and how you're going to challenge that frame. So this time you have to kind of have a mental pivot on your focus. I won't completely focus on my speech now. I'm going to have that killer instinct at the moment, because your role is to destroy what your opponent is saying, right? So suddenly pivot that mindset. This time it's more on how am I going to destroy what they're saying? But especially if you're not finished with building your speech, make sure not to leave your speech alone, especially if it's still incomplete. So it's likely that your opponent already has established their frame. They were already able to, they're starting to explain their argument. Maybe during the time when your opponent is um, quite maybe quite repetitive in some of the things that they're saying, or maybe if they're just further deepening the explanation to an already clear point, then maybe that's when you could for a few moments go back to your speech and start continue rather building it. If especially if you already understood what your opponent has said, that's when you can take a little break and quick break and go back to your speech. But if you don't understand what your opponent is saying yet, make sure to focus on understanding them first. Because if you don't know what they're saying, you won't be able to rebut them. If you don't know what to rebut, then it might be bad for your team. So again, the safe time to stop focusing on your opponent's speech, or not really stop focusing, but more on like decrease your focus on that their speech, is when you already have a full understanding of what they said. And then if they start saying new things that you are yet to understand, that's when you go back to them as well. But during the moments when you have a full understanding of what they're saying, visit your speech again and try to rebuild it. So that's basically how the mental process can work when you're deputy during the middle of the round. And again, the focus on rebuttals is so important because you are the only speaker left in your team to recover. Sure, you have the ability to give POIs after your speech, but POIs are severely limited. Sometimes we're not able to deliver the, you know, the best execution of a point in just 15 seconds. So now that you have 7 minutes for yourself, you really have to be able to think of rebuttals that will help your team recover, because that's the one long time left for your team to like be able to defend itself. So that's how the mental process should work. I mean, not really should work, but more like recommendedly. That's how it can work when you're deputy in the middle of the round. Now, what to do when rebutting? It's still a mid-round thing. When rebutting, what are the things that I can take note of? Because I might panic, right? There's so much material in what my opponent's saying, especially if they're a really, really good opponent. How should I prioritize? What should I address? So here are the questions that you can ask yourself and try to answer while you are thinking in the middle of the round. Number one, what did your opponent say as a rebuttal to your partner? So, as deputy, it's important that you rebut their rebuttal, because once your partner spoke and then your opponent was able to rebut them, usually in the mind of the judges, they might be thinking, oh, that rebuttal was good. That rebuttal kind of left a dent on the case of the opening opposition. So, you as a deputy should start trying to listen very carefully to what your opponent said as a rebuttal to your team, and you need to focus on being able to recover from that rebuttal. So, sure, it's important that you rebut your opponent's arguments, right? The arguments, all of their analysis, all of their impacts. But don't ever forget to respond to their response to you. So you get what I mean? Like, if you leave that hanging kasi, your judges might think that, oh, their rebuttal to your team stands, and deputy was not able to recover, deputy was not able to um respond to that question coming from their opponent. So that's going to be affecting your scores. That's going to be affecting the judgment of the debate. But if you were able to like address the questions and the strong rebuttals from your opponent, and you explicitly said so in your speech, then the judges are gonna think that, oh, they were brave enough to respond to it. This is their response. This is the way that they defended themselves, and this is the way that they recovered. So rebut right away the rebuttals of your opponent to you, or at least respond to their strongest rebuttals to you in order to minimize the damage on your team. So I know that a lot of people, like especially some beginners, because I experienced this as well when I was beginning. If I hear a good rebuttal from my opponent, sometimes what I would do before is just ignore it. And then I'll just make whatever rebuttals that I can and give the argument that I prepped so that I'm finished with my speech. Yay, voila, we're done. But then again, if you look at it as a whole, you will not be able to win the debate if you let your fears take over. That's why you really have to be fearless when you're a deputy speaker. You have to identify what was their strongest case against us, and this is my response to that. So that really is your role, because your first speaker will not be able to do that for you anymore. So accept that role already. Um, the second thing that you can rebut or like focus on when you are listening to your opponent is their frame. And ask yourself, what is so strong about their frame? Are they is their narrative all about like caring for minorities and that's why it makes it so sellable to the judges? Is their narrative all about caring about the principle and were they able to execute it so well for the judges to think that pragmatic things don't matter? So that's what you have to make sense of in your head. What is their frame and why is it quote unquote benta? Why is it sellable? Because your role is to do the exact opposite and um change that narrative or like change the way that judges will look at their frame. Because at the moment, if their frame is all about, oh, we're the team who cares the most about minorities because blah, 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 blah. As a deputy, you have to be able to identify that in your head that, oh, that's their strategy. So my role is to make the judges think that their team is actually not the most friendly to minorities. So something like that, right? You have to um fight head on the frame that they are able to establish. So you have to take it down by pointing out maybe the underlying illogical assumptions of their frame, whether or not it's relevant to the debate. Because maybe it sounds so good, like they're the team who, again, maybe was able to talk about why principle is better than pragmatic. But you have to question, is that frame really the most relevant one to the debate? Maybe the most relevant thing to talk about here are the practicalities of things. So you need to have that kind of thought process. That's why you need to really be able to question their frame. Um, and now you have to start having thought processes as well on why your frame is better or the more correct frame, or even if even if you assume that their frame is correct, why do you still win the debate? So maybe you can assume that sure, they really are the team who cares the most about minorities and was able to protect minorities the most. But even then, even in their frame, why is your team still the winner of the debate? So those are the questions that you need to constantly like ask yourself when you are listening to your opponent during their speech. And once you have answers to that, make sure to write them down, not necessarily word for word, you just need to understand what you mean and make sure that it comes out of your speech when you start giving your speech as the deputy. So, I know it's very challenging, but I personally would suggest focusing on these things because they are how you can prioritize and win the day. So, of course, it's also important to prioritize to address their arguments and their extensions. Um, if you're government or opening government, what are the main arguments of LO, and why do they not hold water in the debate? What do you think will DLO talk about next? Make sure to try to preempt as well. If you're opposition or if you're DLO, what did your partner fail to rebut? And did DPM provide an extension? Maybe they weren't able to extend as much. You can point that out in your speech. If they were able to deliver an extension, make sure to rebut that extension. So maybe the this sounds like you still need to do a lot in rebuttals, right? But maybe my advice in rebuttals is to avoid rebutting like the very nitty gritty parts of the speech, because when speeches have explanations under them, there's many like micro parts, micro explanations within. So my advice is to perhaps not focus entirely on the micro explanations, because these micro explanations are under one main frame or one main point. So maybe you could focus on the main point, um which if you're able to rebut them successfully, then you will probably be able to rebut the rest under that big point already. You get what I mean? Because there's a tendency, like if we hear like one small micro explanation and we felt like, oh, that's wrong. But being able to rebut that doesn't necessarily mean that you were able to rebut their whole full assumption already. So focus on the big assumptions, focus on the big points, focus on what they lacked as a whole, focus on the meta as well. I know you guys know what meta means. It's like um focus on what they were not able to do to fulfill their role as the opening opposition or the opening government. So those are the things that you need to be able to point out. You have to be very sharp so that you can win um, the debate. And these are things you need to think about mid round, in the middle of the round. Okay. I think this is the last slide for mid round strategies. So very important as well is to communicate with your first speaker. So just because your first speaker is done with their speech doesn't mean that they're done with the debate. It doesn't mean that they have no more roles to fulfill and they have no more obligation to you. Because you have an obligation to each other for the whole time that the round is going on, and that also includes, like, in the middle of the round when you're preparing for your speech. So in the absolute, like, it's very important that you communicate with your first speaker, because sometimes your first speaker might have sudden ideas maybe after their speech. They want to tell you that, oh, make sure to focus on this, make sure to mention this, I wasn't able to say this, maybe it should appear on your speech. And you have to be able to listen to that as well. Perhaps you have your own communication channel, maybe through Discord. And now that there's a lot of face to face debating, maybe you can pass notes to each other physically. And communication is still important because you need to get a feel of how each other is doing in the middle of the round. In the absolute worst case that you are unable to build important parts of your argument, or maybe in the absolute worst case that you're unable to make a lot of rebuttals, because there will be some instances when you're not able to do all the responsibilities of deputy in 14 to 21 minutes. It's okay. I mean, I'm not saying that it's okay all the time, but at that moment in the round, you don't need to beat yourself up for not fulfilling all the roles. Sometimes it happens, and it's important that if these unfortunate things happen, you communicate with your first speaker and ask for help. We human beings feel a lot of pride, right? And we feel a lot of like, I need to be the one to do this. This is my role. But sometimes it just happens that we're not able to do it all by ourselves. And it's no shame if you go ahead and chat your partner, I don't have rebuttals yet. Please help me out. Or you can chat them and say that um, I'm focusing on rebuttals right now because the opponent's speech is very packed. So I need your help in building my second argument. You can definitely tell them that. So wag kayong mahiya. And if you're also the first speaker, be very open to your partner asking for help if they're deputy, because your deputy is doing a lot of things on their mind as well. So um, my other tip is that if your partner will help you with building the last part of your speech, or maybe writing down rebuttals because you're working on your extension, my advice is to write it word for word. Why? It's because if they just whisper it into your ear while you're writing something different and they're telling you something else, it's very difficult to do that kind of multitasking because it's so many thoughts and voices happening all in one go. So if you ask for help, my advice is that partner or your first speaker, just write it word for word. Just trust that what they wrote is going to be aligned with your speech. And they just tell you, okay, you say this at the end of your speech. Make sure to say this in your conclusion. And then just read it out loud after you were able to say the parts that you were able to prepare yourself. Because if you still get your partner to explain so many things and they weren't able to write it like in a sentence that makes sense, like for example they just wrote 3 words, it's going to be very difficult for deputy already to manage that kind of too much thinking at the moment. So the partner should have that kind of responsibility to give that sort of help and not mess with the current thought process of deputy. So that's also very important. The deputy already has a lot of thought processes while doing all of these mid-round like thinking. So we might end up losing the momentum if the partner that you ask for help from will make you pause and just explain what they think, because you're not prepping anymore, you're already in the middle of the round. You might start your speech in 1 or 2 minutes, so you don't have the luxury of like that closed space to bounce ideas off of each other and further improve it. So that kind of help in the middle of the round would be good if it's already like fully established, fully like in a um complete sentence that you trust that if you read it, it's going to be making your speech better. So it has a lot of trust involved. Um, and it's just possible that the deputy might just panic more if you stop them from their thought process. So that's why this is my advice. But again, if this is not what works for you, if you tried having that bouncing off ideas even in the middle of your thought process, then that's okay. Then that's good. But always remember that no matter what strategy that you're going to have in the middle of the round, if you're deputy, debate is a team sport. You're not on your own. So asking for help is completely all right. And I think that ends the mid-round strategies um, lecture for deputy. So we talked about what you do in prep. We talked about what you do in the middle of the round in your 14 to 21 minutes. Oh, we're still in mid round. Sorry. I knew it. It's still very long when you're talking about mid round things for deputy. So in the middle of the round, you also need to do lots of meta debating. So what is meta debating? For those who don't know it, it's the debate about the debate, not about the argument itself. So the reason why I put this in the mid round strategy is we're talking about your thought process here before you give your speech, right? And your thought process needs to include the overall dynamic of the debate. So where can you find meta debating? Debating can be found during the time when you are readjusting the frame. So, for example, you're gonna um, think and also maybe put in your speech that this debate is not about X. It's not about Y. Oh, sorry. The debate is about X. It's not about Y. But even if this is about Y, it was our team who proved to you that it's much better off on our side. We told you that we're able to win on both frames, but the opposing team stuck to their frame until the end. So these are basically how it could appear on your speech, but these are things you already think about in the middle of the round. Like how come um the opponent is so adamant about their frame? Did they try to engage with us? I don't think so. So try to have those kinds of thoughts. Like, did they engage with my partner on this? Did they engage with our frame on this one? Were we able to engage on both frames and all that? So those are things that you think about because you're already talking about the debate and not just the arguments of your opponents. You're talking about what has transpired after everybody's speeches so far. Um, and you use those thoughts to convince the judge that you were the team who deserves to win. So when you're readjusting the frame, there's a lot of meta debating thoughts that you can think of and also put it in your speech. But you could also do meta debating when you are concluding your arguments and your rebuttals. So maybe you could say, for example, in your arguments, you could say that in our arguments we prove to you why is the most important value in this debate, and we were able to weigh it against X, which is what the opposing team provided. And since we're the team who proved that importance, our arguments are more relevant in the debate. So, as you notice, lines like these no longer talk about the specifics of the argument, but they talk about the dynamic of the debate. And that's what meta debating is. And as a deputy, you have to think about what space your team was able to fill in the round in terms of arguments. You have to think of how much the arguments of the opponent were able to hold water and importance in the debate. And you have to explicitly also tell the judges that your arguments were the ones that hold more importance. So it's really necessary that you think of these in the middle of the round, because what you think of in the middle of the round will have to appear in your speech. If you don't think about these, your speech is just likely to look like reframe, rebuttals, arguments, conclusion. But it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be just you argue and then you conclude and you're done. You have to talk about why your team, in comparison to the others, um, is the much better team. So it's somehow a little bit like you are already kind of whipping, because you don't have a whip in your opening team, but you still need someone to talk about the meta debate. You still need someone to talk about which team has done it better, because it's different to say we did better than to just talk about your argument, and you have to do both. So you need to make sure that you're able to think of these things already. And that's also applicable to rebuttals. When you conclude your rebuttals, you can do meta debating. You can say that all of their arguments completely relied on the X assumption. But because we were able to completely destroy that assumption, given my rebuttal earlier, then all of their arguments no longer hold water. So look, it's as if you are spelling it out to the judges that this is what my rebuttal did. Instead of just rebutting, right? You can just rebut. They said they said this, that. It's untrue because blah, blah, blah. And now I move on to my arguments. So that's not really the most ideal way to be deputy. Because before you move on to your arguments, you have to explain explicitly and spell it out to the judges that because I was able to give this rebuttal, this is how you should view the opposing team, right? So having that added layer for the judges to, you're kind of good judging, like, you're kind of guiding the judges into how they're going to do their oral adjudication. That's what, like, doing the meta part, or like talking about the meta debate is going to do. And as deputy, you have to do that spelling out. You have to do that explicit um self-judging, and like judging their own debate by how you think it happened and why your team won. Because if you don't do that, then the judges might not be able to take note. The judges might not be able to make that conclusion themselves. So you are the ones making that conclusion already. And like you're just leaving the judge to believe whether or not it's true. So instead of them having to think for themselves, oh, what did that rebuttal do to the other team? You already tell the judge, no, my rebuttal did this to the other team. And then the only thought process that the judges will do at this point will be like, is that true? Were they able to really do that with that specific rebuttal? So that's going to make it easier for judges as well, and can increase your chances of winning. So make sure to do that spelling out. All right. And lastly, hopefully lastly on mid round, I'm not entirely sure, but um when you are a deputy, you also have the role to guard yourself from what has not yet been said. And when we are talking about what has not yet been said, we're talking about the closing half. So you also need to have good foresight. You need to have a good prediction of what could come out in the debate. So in the middle of the round, you have to think of these two. And maybe it can translate to your speech by saying that these are the things that we were able to tackle, and these are the things that we were able to prove are the most significant factors. So if the closing team tries to run anything remotely close to what we said, then it should be credited to us. So those are some thought processes that you should already have as deputy and translate it into your speech. So maybe you could say something like that, like to prevent hijacking. I know you guys have been victims of hijacking closing teams as well, and sometimes we can't deny that they did that very well. But for you to be able to prevent getting hijacked, you should explicitly think of why your team is the most significant one, and what are the things that you were able to prove are most important. And then maybe tell the judge that if we were the team that prove to you that these three things are the most important. So if closing anything related to that, then it should be credited to us. Something like that. You can have those kinds of thought processes in the middle. But also, you can do some burden push. So you can burden push. If you're a deputy prime minister, if you're DPM, you can burden push DLO as another deputy. You could say stuff like, or think of stuff like, in order for the opposition team to win, or for open opposition to win this debate, they have to give a solid justification for XYZ. So start thinking of things you can tell the judge that would guide them in their OA. And that could include burden pushing. Or against your closing, you could say stuff like, um, if you are deputy leader of opposition rather, and the next speaker is member of government and closing government, right? Maybe you could burden push and say that if closing government does not address even just one of the five layers that we provided, then that means they have to be penalized for being engaging. So you're already kind of giving a standard to the judge that this is how you should judge the debate. We gave five layers of analysis, and if there's one of these analysis that they did not address, they have to be they have to get minus points for it and stuff like that. So you're kind of doing that to help the judge navigate how they're going to do their OA. And you can do that in the you can think of what to say in the middle of the round and apply that when you're already gonna give your speech. Okay. We're not yet done with mid round. So other tips for mid round things that you need to think of or you need to prioritize. If you're a deputy, the intro is very, very, very important. So my advice if you're going to write an introduction and as deputy is to write it verbatim, meaning write it word for word. Unless you have already full confidence of like how what you're going to say is gonna be like a winning intro, then go ahead. You don't need to write it word for word. But if you think you need to be very, very strategic at this point on how you're going to enter the debate, my advice is to write it word for word. The intro should be very clear and should be done with intent. It's not just intro for the sake of intro. It has to have the intent to reframe. So I mentioned earlier that maybe your opponent had a good frame. So the first line of your speech should be very strategic in reframing for your team and readjusting what should be the priorities of the debate. It should be like that. Or maybe it could have the intent to completely destroy the other team's frame. It should have perhaps also the intent to rebuild. If at that moment you diagnose that right now they need to hear what my partner was not yet able to say, so maybe your intro should fill those gaps. Or maybe at this point of the debate, you diagnose that there was a major burden push from your opponent and you need to be able to answer that. So maybe your intro should have the intent to boldly answer that burden push and show to the judges that even if you had a very strong burden push to us, this is our answer, this is our response. Because the intro is both your shield and your weapon against the other opening team. And if you just make a very value neutral intro for the sake of intros, you know how we do intros like in declamation speeches or like other kinds of speeches. If we do it that way, just to make things a little spicy or a little nice sounding, but it doesn't have intent, then you might be wasting 1 minute of your speech for an intro that doesn't really do much to the debate. So here are the things that I would suggest you avoid if you're gonna make an intro, because every second in your 7 minutes matters. Avoid saying or like avoid entering the debate and say, this is what I'll be doing in my speech. One, I will do this. Two, I will make rebuttals. Three, I will give you three arguments. So if you listen to that like line of introduction and you think about it very deeply, it doesn't do much to the debate. You don't really need to give the judge a summary of what you're already about to say, because you're going to say them anyway, and that's just going to eat up a few a good 30 seconds of your time, when you could have used that to make a very catchy intro. You could have used that to make, or to say an intro can, in 10 seconds, destroy the frame of your partner. So that's what I want you guys to think about when you're doing your intro. um it should have a purpose. It shouldn't just be any intro like that has a quote or whatever. So another type of intro that I would advise you guys to avoid is like, I'm going to start my speech with rebuttals, one, two, three. So um you should have rebuttals, of course, that's a requirement, but you don't start your speech with like your formatted rebuttals. You don't just go ahead like, I'm just gonna start with my rebuttals, one, two, three. Because number one, that's not catchy. But number two, um, it's better if you have an intro that already kind of addressed their big frame or the big problem in the debate before you go to your rebuttals. And the reason for that is because if you have an intro that already maybe reframed or destroyed the other team's frame, then your rebuttals are going to be much stronger because they were supported by your very strong intro. But if you start with just your rebuttals, it's going to be harder for the judges to kind of like um credit them, because they're not being said, or your rebuttals are not being said under a new frame or under a new assumption in the debate, right? You're not able to support yourself with that. So still important that you have a very catchy, intentful intro. And then lastly, avoid using quotes or anecdotes or maybe some other material that doesn't have a clear intent. Of course, you can use like some quotes, but only if those quotes are actually there to um have intent again that will completely destroy the frame of your opponent and all that. So, for example, in an econ debate that's very specific, you don't need to go ahead and make an intro like money makes the world go round. Like, sure, it sounds good on paper. Maybe if we have, maybe if this was an essay, right? Like, it's so nice start with introductions like that. But when you're in a debate, you don't need to tell the judges that money makes the world go round. Everybody knows that already. That's like 5 seconds less of good material in your speech, because what we call quotes like these, they're called value neutral. They're not here to really um address anything. They're just some sentiments, right? And in a debate, we try to avoid those kinds of like introductions, just so if we have an intent to win, right? So yeah, those are my advice for mid round. Oh, there you go. Yeah, mid round strategies for deputy. Um, yeah. Now, in during the debate or during your speech, um, we have like sort of like an ideal way to manage our time, but then again, of course, it varies from speech to speech. It doesn't mean that because I try to have a guide like this doesn't mean that all of my speeches, I ended my intro at 1:30 and started my rebuttals at 1:30 onwards. It's not like that. It's really mainly just a guide for those who have like huge difficulties in being able to manage their time completely. And for a lot of starting debaters, this is their problem. So this one depends from debate, like every debate as well. Maybe some of the themes, like for example, if you're in a policy debate, maybe you need to do more setup and all that. But ideally, it would be good to use the first 1 minute and 30 seconds for your intro, building and readjusting if you're a deputy prime minister. And then 1:30 to 3:30, so you have your timer with you, right? 1:30 to 3:30, start doing rebuttals and preemptions if you're DPM. 3 to 6:30, extensions. 6:30 to 7:15, conclude and seal. And same with DLO. But this time you just have lots more to rebut because you have already had two speakers talk before you, right? So 0 to 130, just an introduction, rebuild and readjusting. And 1:30 to 3:30, rebut the whole opening government. 3 to 6:30, provide your extension. 6:30 to 7:15, conclude and seal. Notice how I didn't put meta debating anywhere. It's because, as I said earlier, you can do debating anywhere. You can do it you can do it after your rebuttals. You can do it while concluding your extensions. Um, you can do it in your conclusions. So there's no prescribed format as to where you're going to do the meta debating part. But this time management is just basically like something you can use to police yourself. For example, you're already um like it's already 4 minutes and you're still in your intro. There's definitely something that needs to be fixed in there, right? So for example, it's already um let's say it's only 30 seconds and you're already in your arguments. You haven't done rebuttals like and all that stuff, or like you did rebuttals way too fast. So that probably means you weren't able to invest as much time in your reframe just yet. So that's just really how this can help you. You don't need to follow it like um religiously. Again, it varies from debate to debate, but it's just really how to police yourself. For example, it's only like 5:30 and you're already done with your extension. So that probably means wow, I have 1 minute and 30 seconds left and I have no material left. Maybe what I can do to improve next time is to add more layers to my argument so that um I can make it more, you know, in depth and more substantial, so more substantiated. Just those kinds of things. Okay. And then the next part of my deputy lecture will be about what can I say when I'm on deputy? Because earlier our lesson was more on um, what should I focus on? How am I going to manage my time? What should my thought process be? But now the next part is what can I say when I'm a deputy speaker? So just a note here, um, deputy speakers should be able to provide novel extensions. And I think you guys have that basic knowledge already that deputy speaker is an extension speaker. Um, these extensions that you are going to give should not necessarily be born from existing debate templates because some of the best deputy speeches are the ones with very novel arguments. You don't need to follow certain templates, right? But to be able to think of arguments or new extensions in such a short time is admittedly very difficult, which is also why we have frameworks and some advice on like templates on what you can do or what you can say as deputy as a last resort. Or it's kind of like a cheat guide when we have nothing else we can think of. So again, the next things that I'm going to teach you today for deputy are the last resorts that you can cling to if you really have no new argument you can think of. So, what first do we mean by novel ideas? Because again, the ideal deputy speech or extension should have novel ideas that can elevate the debate. Um, Novel ideas are basically um, arguments that are going to be aligned with your partner, but not necessarily the same. It shouldn't be the same as what your partner said. So let's give an example of what a novel idea like looks like in a debate. So, for example, a debate needs you to prove that a parent has no interest to unschool the children, their children. So meaning unschool, like get them out of traditional school. And you have to prove that in an actor motion that the parent doesn't have interest to unschool their children. They want their children to be in traditional school. Maybe your partner focused on why parents have the primary interest to care for their children's future and why unschooling is going to jeopardize that future. So maybe your partner talked about how Traditional schools are the ones that could give them the career pathing and the necessary like curriculum standard curriculums that will help them help the children get better in the future. And it's the parents' interest to care about the future of their children. Maybe that's what your partner mainly focused on. So as a deputy, you can start another another extension that is novel, um in a sense that you're not going to focus on the parents' interest to care for their children's future. You could provide another interest. You can talk about why it's also the interest of the parent to build a good interpersonal relationship with their child. And you can only build a good relationship with your child if you don't unschool them. So you can talk also about like why parents are interested perhaps in saving money and managing finances. And you can say that unschooling is more expensive. So you realize here that you as a team, you don't need to focus on just one interest of the parent. Maybe your partner focused on parents care about the future of the children and all that. Then as deputy, you don't need to um defend your team under that particular interest only. You could think of other interests of a parent in this particular debate. You make sure that that interest does not contradict your partner, it just adds to it, and you can make your speech focus on that. So now you have a full complete set of arguments because your partner says that it's the interest of the parent to care for their kid's future, and now and that unschooling is bad for the children's future. Now your speech is all about it's the interest of the parent to have a good relationship with their child, and unschooling is bad for the relationship with the child. So now you have two different like assumptions in your full team that you're able to defend and use against unschooling, and that's why your extension is novel, but still aligned with your partner in saying that unschooling is a bad thing and that parents don't want it. So that's an example of a novel idea. These arguments are different materials from each other, but are not contradictory. You are merely adding more material and covering more ground, which is the best way for you to win on opening. So ideally, every deputy speech should be able to find out whatever novel idea you can insert that's going to add to your partner's um, speech and your material. But sometimes it's hard to think of novel ideas because novel ideas and new angles really come from having more knowledge on the topic. Especially, for example, if it's a matter heavy motion like IR or econ or media and all that, for you to have novel ideas as extensions, you need to know what's going on in those topics. So the best solution for you to actually be good at deputy and good at making extensions is to really read up, research on all possible topics that could come up in a debate, and that's going to help you provide angles and contexts that other people would not be able to think of. And that's how you can win an opening. Like you can significantly boost your chances at winning. But in the event that you really are unable to think of novel ideas, that's when you can make use of some frameworks. And those are the frameworks that I will be teaching you guys also. So, again, this is assuming that you don't have a new idea. But again, a new idea is still the most recommended one. But if you don't have an idea, um, there are number one framework, we have new actors. So you could try to think of the new actors that haven't been mentioned in the debate. So actors in the debate vary, but it's likely that your intuitive case or your partner's speech has not been able to tackle all of the relevant actors that are involved. So you can supply an extension that talks about those actors that your partner wasn't able to focus on. For example, we have policy debates. And in a policy debate, maybe your partner was able to talk about the effects and the harms and the benefits of a policy on the state and maybe on corporations. So the big things, those are the actors that your partner focused on. But in their 7 minutes, they weren't to talk about people on the ground. So maybe you can talk about that specifically in your speech. So if you have nothing else in your mind and you need an extension, try to figure out, oh, maybe my partner was not able to talk much about a specific actor. Maybe that's what I can focus on. So this time, maybe you can talk about how it affects consumers and you can talk about how it affects employees and why that is good or why that is bad. So let's give an example here. We have the motion. This house would provide tax breaks to businesses that are dying under the pandemic. So to simplify, you are basically like giving tax incentives to those businesses that are closing down during a public health emergency, meaning maybe you don't need to make them pay so much taxes because there's a really bad economic health problem going on. And you pretend that you're opening government. Maybe your partner already talked about how this is good for the economy, this is good for the state, this is good for the businesses themselves because they will be able to stay afloat. And if that's the focus of your partner, you can diagnose that my partner has not really talked yet about how it will affect the average employee. So as an extension, maybe I can focus on the average employee. Maybe you can say that the tax break is very important because if a company during the pandemic does not need to pay as much taxes, then they're gonna be able to keep some money to still continue providing enough salaries for their employees. Therefore, the tax breaks will be helpful in in making employees keep their jobs and making employees still be able to live their day-to-day lives, feed their children, um, pay their rent and pay their bills. So, see, it's a different angle now because you're talking about how it affects an average person and how it will affect everything that they're engaged in every day. It's a debate about tax breaks, it's about economics, it's about a pandemic. But since you thought of another actor who will be affected by situations like these that your partner was not able to talk about, then there you have it. You have a new extension and you're able to fulfill your role as a deputy speaker. So number one framework, again, if you have nothing else to say or like you couldn't think of anything as an extension when you're deputy, think, is there an actor that we are missing? Maybe that's who I can talk about in my speech. So that's framework number one. Let's go to framework number two. If there's a way to think about new actors, there's also a way to think about the micro or macro level effects of a policy or like the motion, basically. So, if your partner focused on how the motion affects the individual, maybe your partner talked about how it will affect the individual psychologically, mentally, maybe their behavior as a person, maybe their feelings. That's the micro level. But if that's their focus and they weren't able to talk about the macro, the bigger picture, then maybe you are the one who can talk about the bigger picture. So if your partner talked about the individual, you can talk about how it affects societal behavior, trends in how people are going to treat each other as a whole or as a society, or the behavior of the community and vice versa. So for example, if your partner talked about the community, you can talk about the individual. So this is also very helpful in IR debates and geopolitics debates about certain countries. Maybe your partner can talk about like the main countries involved in the motion. Um, like for example, if it's all about um, uh, US and another country, like maybe like let's say Afghanistan, US Afghanistan. Um, it doesn't necessarily mean that the debate is um exclusive to just those two countries, especially because these are about international relations, right? So if your partner talked about only mainly on US and Afghanistan, then you can start talking about how it affects other countries. Because for sure, there's a way to talk about that. There's still a way that international relations will affect other countries that are not explicitly mentioned in the motion. So you can talk about China, you can talk about Russia and the rest of the international community. So those are the micro or macro level um, effects that you can talk about if you have no other thoughts or other extensions in mind. You can consider thinking, what are the smaller things that this motion affects? Or what are the bigger things that this motion affects that my partner was not able to talk much about? Okay, so that's the second framework. So we have the actor framework, we have the micro or macro level framework. Next, we have one of my favorites, principled or pragmatic. So if earlier you can think of who are the actors that we are missing, or you can think about what are the smaller things that we should be considering in the debate, or what are the bigger things we should consider in the debate. This time, you can also consider an extension that focuses either on a principle or on the pragmatic. What do we mean by this? So if your partner focused heavily on outcomes, effects, and pragmatic results, then you can choose to provide a heavily principled extension to prove to the judge you can win both on the pragmatic and the principled lens. Or vice versa, if your partner focuses on the principle, you can turn that principle into pragmatic outcomes in your speech so you don't get accused of being abstract or having no valuable results. Here's a very good example for this one. Let's say the motion is this house would criminalize red tagging, and you are in opening opposition, meaning you are against criminalizing people who do red tag. Red tag. For those who don't know what red tagging is, it's basically any form of like accusation to perhaps like students or individuals, maybe activists, accusing them of being terrorists or accusing them of being part of insurgent or terrorist groups just because they are exercising their right to vote. Say, this is very common among, let's say, UP students. If you hear the news, um, UP students usually try to voice their opinions out, and they go to rallies. And someone who red tags is somebody who says that, oh, nagrarally na naman yan ng NPA, or they're part of a terrorist group because they are holding rallies. So that's what red tagging is. Um, it was very common during the presidency of former President Rodrigo Duterte. If you watch any of his like speeches and Sona and all that stuff. So that's what the motion is about. And you are against criminalizing red tagging. So maybe your partner focused on why we shouldn't criminalize red tagging because it's not effective in educating people about their right. Like it's not effective in educating people to stop red tagging. Like, it's, for example, if um we bring them to jail just because they said that activists are terrorists and we send them to jail, it's not necessarily gonna make them change their mindset. They're still gonna think that those people are terrorists. It's gonna make them even more angry, and they're not gonna understand the gravity of, like, they're not gonna understand why what they thought was wrong. Like, um it doesn't it doesn't fix the root cause of the problem. It doesn't educate them, basically. So criminalizing is not equal to educating. Maybe that's what your partner is going to say, which is a pragmatic outcome. That's pragmatic because it talks about the effects of criminalizing and why, again, it's not effective at all. So if your partner focused on that and why that's not a very effective solution, and you notice that, oh, that's a very pragmatic line of argumentation, you can make a speech all about why, in principle, it's just morally abhorrent to criminalize people who read that. And you can start saying that the people who read that are just victims of misinformation and propaganda that was fueled for so many years now. Propaganda from institutions that are anti activists and anti freedom of expression, and they've been fueling this propaganda and misinformation, and like your local, your average tita who's accusing their um their niece of being a terrorist was just someone who was misinformed. And to criminalize them is morally abhorrent because we are criminalizing the people who are just victims of the state as well, or victims of misinformation as well. And we should be fighting against the real enemy. But criminalizing these people means we are making enemies of those who can be part of our side. So therefore criminalizing is morally bad. So that's the principled line for you to like that you can take if you're a deputy. You can focus on why this is disadvantageous maybe to minorities. You could even talk about how people who criminal or people who are victims of misinformation are often those who don't have access to education. And it's not their fault that they don't have access to education and critical thinking. Maybe they're the people who don't have like the money to be sent into a really good school that would help them think critically enough to be good at um, distinguishing what's fake news from what isn't fake news. And we have the institution, like powerful institutions, who are taking advantage of their lack of education by brainwashing them into thinking that activists are terrorists. So, meaning they are just victims as well. They're already disadvantaged in the first place. They are the minorities that the state or the institution, powerful institutions, are using as a tool to forward their propaganda, and to criminalize them would be to um um it's like we are helping the very enemy themselves by criminalizing people who are actually like not at fault for being brainwashed into thinking these things. So that's a principled argument. And that's very different from what your partner focused on, which is the effectiveness of it. But when you pair them up together as a team, it's going to be a very strong pair of principled and pragmatic arguments. So that's what you can focus on. If your partner focused on either a principled or pragmatic argument, you make an extension that will complement what they provided. And that's another extension framework. Okay, next. Another framework for extensions would be timelines. So now what you can look at would be um, the whole timeline of things. So it's possible that your partner only focused on the effects of emotion at present or the very near future, but perhaps not the long term effects. So you can try to explore the precedents that a certain motion will set and how that's going to affect society. So maybe your partner will talk about how um, these are the immediate effects. These are the short term effects. But there's a way to argue it. Like, what if 10 years from now, or like in the like far future ahead, what could be the new cultural norms, what could be the new societal behaviors far into the future if we follow this motion. So again, try to explore the cultural changes, the overall behavioral changes that something can do. Imagine what it would be like 10 years from now, 30 years from now. What will be the new norm? What will be the new trend? So, for example, the motion is this house would legalize abortion and you are opening government. Maybe your partner talked about how legalizing abortion is going to um it's going to help women access safe abortion, there's gonna be lesser, like there's no more black market. It's going to be heavily regulated, and that um uh abortions that are going to be done are much more medically supervised and all that. um so that's good, right? Maybe your partner is going to say why it's good for women. Now it's going to be good for um their health. Now what you can talk about would be, what would legalizing do to the norm we have right now? How is it going to transform in the future? So maybe your extension in terms of timelines can focus on why this is good for the perception of society towards women and women who go through abortion. So maybe you can talk about the legalization of it makes it legitimate, makes it authoritative, and causes a cultural reset that would set the precedence um, to many other things. So for example, if we legalize abortion now, it will cause a domino effect. Like maybe there will be actual, there's better education on abortion being a form of healthcare. It can seep into schools and important institutions, and that's going to affect the narratives that go over in society and will bring, it will challenge the stigma against women and against abortion. So years from now, it's going to be a highly accepted thing. There's going to be lesser women who get discriminated for it. There's going to be a better perception that abortion is a form of healthcare and not a form of killing a human being. So now, in terms of timeline, you're talking about the long term effect of it and why that would be good, not just for women, but for society as a whole. You're going to talk about how it affects educational institutions. You're going to talk about how it affects day to day interactions in the future and how women will be treated in society. So that's something that you can explore in terms of timelines. What are the long term effects? If your partner focus more on long-term effects, then do the opposite. Should focus on the short-term effects as well. So just have that sort of um like thought process as well. Make sure that you catch what your partner focused on so that you know what you can focus on and where can you insert yourself. Okay? Next, we have another framework. There's a lot of frameworks, right? So for sure, there's no way that you will have nothing to say at deputy. That's the solution for I mean, this is like what's gonna help us not be speechless at deputy. Next, we have the flip framework. So if you really can't think of an extension, build one that flips the arguments of your opposing team. What do we mean by this? If they're claiming a certain benefit, like let's say X benefit, provide a comprehensive and extremely substantiated material that analyzes why that benefit is actually never going to happen on their side. So it's also a bit of like a rebuttal extension, but you focus more on substantiating why it's never going to happen on their side, it's only going to happen on your side. So, for example, if they argue that their main value is accessibility, you can make an extension entirely about why accessibility is only going to happen on your side. You're basically kind of stealing that benefit from them. So let's give an example. If you're opening government in a motion, this house regrets the commercialization of indigenous art, meaning like um, talks on like Apawang Od and like um her selling the services of putting tattoos on other people when originally those tattoos were given to warriors who were able to kill opponents or like other tribes in ancient times and all that. So or maybe just selling indigenous art in general, indigenous paintings, indigenous musical instruments and all that. So your opening government says that they regret the commercialization of indigenous art because it loses its meaning and it's not going to be the same anymore, right? Because, for example, if you give a tattoo to a random foreigner who paid Apowang on a bunch of dollars. Originally, the meaning of that tattoo was something so grand, but now it's just a random foreigner who can take it because they have money, right? Opening government will say they regret the commercialization of indigenous art because it loses its meaning. It's gonna make the culture die. In opening opposition, you can make an extension saying that actually it's precisely the commercialization that will prevent the culture from dying. And the culture will only die without the commercialization. So your argument is going to flip it. You're going to say that if like you could provide a context that indigenous art is already slowly dying precisely because the contexts in this world today are already very much different. There's no more tribes killing each other. Therefore, you don't have like that same context to apply the putting of tattoos anymore. But that's still art in itself. And if we don't commercialize it, which is a way of adapting to the new contexts of the new world, then it could end up like it could end with art just losing itself in the process of passing it to different generations. But if you commercialize it, make it accessible to many other people, then that's the way for that art in itself to stay alive. If you don't commercialize it, then it could be gone forever. So that's how you flip and make a flip extension. You steal the benefit of your opponent. You convince the judge that actually that's never gonna happen on their side. It's only gonna happen on our side. So you agree that the benefit of keeping the art is important, but you reframe it in a way that you tell the judge that keeping the art will never happen if we follow opening government. It will only happen on our side when commercialization exists. And that's why indigenous art is still very much known today because commercialization happened. So that's another way of like flipping and extending using a flip. So that's I think our fifth framework. We have another framework next. Oh, sorry, we don't have anyone. Okay, so those are all the frameworks for deputy. It's been quite a long session. It's already 10:42. Okay. Um, so yeah, I hope you guys now feel more confident that you will not bomb your deputy speeches because no matter where you look, there's a way to have content, not just any content, but strategic content. Precisely because we have frameworks that we can look into, but precisely also because we read up a lot and we have novel ideas that we can provide in deputy. And for us to be able to execute those properly, we have to be good with higher round consciousness. So we have to be good with mid round strategy. And that's why the first part of our deputy lecture was all about what we can do in the middle of the round, how our thought processes should work, when we have so many things to think about, how do we prioritize? So I hope that you were able to learn a bunch of things from that first half of our lecture for today. We're moving on to the next part, which is all about the closing half, specifically member speeches. So again, you guys already know the similarities between being a deputy and a member, and I think maybe the whole deputy lecture was able to solidify that even more as to why deputies and members are quite similar. But now let's look into what should be the strategies if you are the member, if you are the person who will enter the debate after the first half, and you're the person who is tasked to provide the identity of the closing team. I love being member, by the way. It's one of I would say it's my favorite position. It's like you are showing to the judges, this is who I am. So what do you do during prep if you're a member? Um, Very important to prep at closing really well because a lot of people are scared at closing because their opponents are gonna stealing their arguments, right? So in prep, when you're closing, and this is also for whip speeches here, whip speakers rather, Always start prep with painting a clear picture of the motion and thinking of what opening is likely to say. Some people, some closing teams, what they do when they start prep as closing is they just start thinking of what could be my argument, what could we say and stuff like that. But that's not really the most helpful strategy just yet. You have to think first of the debate. You don't think of your speech yet. You think of the debate as a whole. So paint a clear picture. This is for your own benefit and your understanding, but can even help you win. Because the advantage that you have here as closing is that perhaps the opening teams might miss painting that clear picture. Especially, I would say, if it's like a philosophy motion and it's a very abstract motion, like this house regrets the premium on forgiveness, right? It's very abstract, and if you're an opening team, you have so much pressure to provide a speech already that you might end up missing how exactly that literally looks like in the real world. So when you're closing, since you don't have the pressure of making a speech right now, then what you do in your thought process is to first think of what does this motion look like on a day-to-day basis? How can we visualize it? So think of the visuals, think of the picture in itself. And that can even help you win the debate because in a lot of motions, especially that are abstract, if the opening teams miss what the picture looks like and you're the one who's able to provide that, oh, judges really, really absolutely love that. So um, always help yourself and guide yourself by thinking of the clear picture. Number two, think of what the opening case is going to be. As I said earlier, don't think of your speech just yet. Think of the debate and think of what will happen in the as an exchange among the opening teams. So the suggestion is do not build your arguments completely just yet. It might waste your time. Just think of very big ideas and the intuitive cases that could appear among the opening themes. Because, for example, if you think of an argument and then you build and build and build and build, and then the first thing that comes out of PM's mouth is the argument that you built during prep, you're gonna panic. You're gonna have no backups or safety nets on what you're gonna say next instead of the argument that you prepared. So what happens is that you might end up repeating what your opening already said because that's what you prepared for, and you might end up losing the debate. So that's my advice. Do not fully build what your opening will say. Do not fully build also what you're going to say. Just think of big ideas and intuitive cases of your opening during the first part of prep. So now, after thinking of those things, how do you move forward? There are two ways that you can move forward during prep. Number one, what you can do is after painting a picture, after thinking of the opening exchange, the next thing that you could do is list as many arguments as possible with your partner. So this is member and whip together, talking to each other. What can we argue now? So now you can start thinking about what your extensions will be. List them down. I've had an experience where I think my partner and I listed like 10 full arguments during prep. We didn't build those arguments. We just listed them down. We just had an idea of what could be said for each of them, but we used our 15 minutes of prep to think of as much arguments as possible. Why? It's because if our opening has said the first two or the first three, just immediately cross them out, go to the next ones on the list. And there you have it, you have an extension. So that's one way to do um, closing prep. But there's another way to do closing prep, and this is the one I advocate for more, is to think of a winning frame. It's a much harder thing to do, but once you're able to think of a winning frame, you don't need to list as much arguments as possible. You can use that to win the debate. So I'll get into these two strategies further in the next slide. So let's go to the first strategy first. First strategy at prep at closing is to list as many arguments as possible. Again, do not build the arguments, just understand the idea behind those new arguments, list them down in a structured manner, in maybe by priority, um, organize them, maximize prep to think of as many arguments as you can so that in the middle of the round, you still have lots of arguments left after the opening exchange. Again, if your opening said your first four arguments on the list, immediately cross them out, go to your fifth, and then that's where you enter the debate. So that's one way to do closing. The other way to do closing, and this is again my most recommended one, and perhaps in my experience, the one that helped us ace the rounds that we wanted to ace, is to think of a winning frame. But again, this is more advanced and it's also a bit harder compared to the first one. So what do we mean by thinking of a winning frame? So when you think of a winning frame, you have to already have a good foresight of what the frame of your opening will be and a foresight of what the frame of your diagonal will be. Um, or basically a good foresight of the frame and the exchange of the first opening themes. And once you have that, that's when you think of where can I enter? What is the new frame that has not yet been discussed by the first two teams that I can suddenly wow the judges with when I enter as a member. So this is only going to work. This strategy is only going to work at closing if you are confident and sure of what's going to appear in the opening debate. If you have that good prediction and you predict how the opening debate will look like and look for a way to make their first debates irrelevant to what the debate actually asked for, or maybe look for a way to make that opening debate seem like their impact is low. So this winning frame is like the way you can tell the judges that sure, opening team focused on this and focused on that, and they had so many rich arguments about this and that. But judges, that's actually not what the debate is supposed to be about, because the debate is supposed to be about this. So that's how you enter with a winning frame. um you are completely like painting the opening half as if shouldn't have happened. Something like that, right? Or maybe, yes, it's okay that it happened, but they were focusing on the things that are really less important. And we are the team who will bring to you what we really need to talk about in this debate. So that's how you think of a winning frame. And try to look for a value or like a goal in the debate that will trump the importance of what the opening exchange has been fighting over or will be fighting over, especially if you're in prep, right? You're talking about this with your whip. And once you're able to figure out the winning frame, once you are completely sure of it, you can start building it. And you can start the extension for it. But of course, make sure that you still have a backup because you don't know. Maybe your opening ends up thinking about that winning frame you thought of as well. But when you think of a winning frame, it's very likely that it's unique and it's not what you will first think when you see a debate motion. But if you look at it deeply, that's really what the core debate is all about. So this will require a lot of trust in yourself and trust in the debate that will happen. But once you're able to execute that quite well, you have a high chance of winning the debate at closing. But I'm not saying that like either of these would be better than each other. In my personal experience, the second one is what helped us, win a few more rounds. But these are still strategies that you can take and maybe you can execute even better. Maybe the first one is the way to win for you, or maybe the second one is the way to win for you. But no matter which path you take as closing, make sure that you agree with your whip on this. Much like how you should have an agreement with your PM or LO when you're a deputy, you need to have that same agreement with your whip as well during prep, or else it's just gonna be messy if both of you don't talk to each other on which path you're going to take. Now, what do you do in the middle of the round if you are the member? And this time, um, this is more specifically on the member's thought process as well. So after prep time, you only you have a lot of time to create your speech. Sorry, that's a typo. You have a lot of time because the whole opening exchange is around 28 minutes, half an hour long, right? You have half an hour to think and make your speech. But the challenge in member is to be able to refine and adjust. And just like in deputy, multitasking is a must. So you have to listen very carefully to all of the opening speakers. You can't miss any of those speeches. You can just you turn off your ear at some point because you feel like it's not important anymore. No, make sure you listen to everybody carefully, but build at the same time. So, going back to the two different strategies that I mentioned earlier, let's talk about the disadvantage and advantage. So, the disadvantage of listing as many arguments as possible is that you're going to have to keep waiting until the deputy speaker of the opening to check if the opening half has already covered your ideas. Say, for example, PM was able to cover your first and second idea. So at that point, you haven't decided yet if you're going to use your third idea because you still have to wait for the deputy prime minister to speak. See if they were also able to steal your third and your fourth idea. So you only get the luxury of making a decision or the ability to make a decision on what your extension is once your opening's deputy is already finished or was able to give their speech already. So that means you have a limited amount of time to decide what your extension and what your identity is. But the advantage of that is you have a wealth of like other arguments to pick from. It's just that you have lesser time to decide on which one. Now, the advantage of thinking of a winning frame at prep is that the moment that the first speaker of the opening half speaks, so for example, if the PM speaks and you're a member of government, the moment that they speak, you already know their frame and you can already make a comparison. Oh, that's the frame that they took. We're going to take a different frame. That's the winning frame that we want. You already can decide as early as that time um, on which path you're going to take or on which extensions you're going to make. And you have more time to build it on the winning frame. Or if you're um opening like first speaker at opening spoke already, start speaking and it's still very similar to your winning frame, then you have so much more time to adjust. So you have all the time in the world as well to build your arguments under the new frame that you thought of during prep. So those are the advantages and disadvantages of the two strategies that I mentioned earlier. Now, what do you do when or like during the speeches of your opponents? When your opening is speaking, so when your direct openings, for example, if you're closing government and your opening government is speaking, listen very intently. Make sure not to write everything that they say word for word. Very important, and like one thing I noticed is that when taking notes, you write word for word, you're not going to be able to comprehend and understand what your um opponent is saying, what your opening is saying. So just listen very carefully, just write down keywords so that you have a full and good understanding of what they're saying. Next, what should be your thought process? These are the questions that you can ask yourself in the middle of the round. What are the crucial points of analysis that they missed? Which crucial values did they fail to provide? Maybe you diagnosed at prep that this debate is supposed to be all about individualism, but your opponent or your opening wasn't able to talk much about why it's going to be very good for the individual. So maybe you can diagnose that and write that down. Or which are the crucial impacts that they were not able to mention? Which angle did they fail to tackle? And what is wrong with their speech. Again, your opening is still your opponent, even if you're defending the same side. So you have to still be very skeptical about them. And you need to really specifically ask yourself these questions. What did they miss? Which values did they not provide? Because that's how our team is going to enter the debate. That's how our team is going to build its own identity in comparison to our opening, who failed to do exactly that. Right? So, really important to have that kind of strategic thinking. So, again, also, when your opening is speaking, and you were able to answer yourself with those questions, type your answers down. So type down, oh, opening was not able to talk about this, that, or that. Write them down, type them down so you don't forget. Um, and it's also important that you are able to explicitly say that in your speech. So write those missing things down in the beginning of your speech. And my advice is to structure them into three major points and make use of those as your points of delineation at the beginning of your speech. Remember, if you're a member, some of the first things that you need to mention would be, why are you so different from your opening? And my advice is to structure them into three, because judges love it when it's structured. You don't just say a free flowing narrative of why you're better than your opening. You structure them into 3 points, very concise and easy to understand. Number one, they did not do this. Number two, they failed to see the value, which is this. And number three, they were not able to provide the actual impacts. And this is where we come in. Done. Right? Very helpful in your delineation. Like 3 points of delineation. Blah blah blah. One, two, three. Pam pam pam. Right? And then you already have a pretty good content for your intro. Of course, when you provide points of delineation, make sure that the content of your speech follows through with that promise. So, for example, if you say that our opening failed to provide the middle analysis as to why this, that, this, that. So if your opening failed to provide that and you promise that you're going to provide that middle analysis, make sure that your speech is going to provide that middle analysis, because it's going to also like be shooting yourselves on the foot if you overpromise and you don't deliver. So you have to make sure that whatever they lack is what can be easily found in the speech that you're going to provide. Okay? So that's number I'm not sure what number anymore. But yeah, again, don't be scared to cross out things that have already been tackled. One thing to avoid really at member is to say the same words. Like um even if sometimes you have a different idea, but you made use of the almost exact same language that your opening used, you might be flagged as a rehash, and that would be unfortunate because your content could have been um sold and framed as something that's much better. But if you kind of follow the way that your opponent speaks, especially in terms of language, like choice of words, it has a danger of being flagged as a rehash. So be very careful with that one. Okay, so that's when in the middle of the round when your opponent is speaking, those are the things that you think about and you prepare for. Sorry, when you're opening rather. But this time, when it's your diagonal that is speaking, meaning if your CG, OO is already speaking. So if OO is speaking and your CG, what do? Again, listening, very important skill. Listen intently. Again, don't write what they say like word for word, and be very alert when it comes to their missing links and their fatal assumptions. Be very alert with the flaws of their frame. So the usual, but once you understand the big idea of what they're saying, that's when you list it down and formulate rebuttals. Again, another discouragement that I have when it comes to rebutting your diagonal is you don't rebut every single point that they provided. You don't have the luxury of time to rebut all the things they said. Those are two speakers with possibly different arguments from each other. So important important thing to do is to listen carefully. What are the points that they have that I can cluster together into one main assumption or one main argument? What is the big fatal flaw of this team? And that's what your rebuttals can focus on. Why? because it's your whip who can be the one to focus on like the macro and micro rebuttals, right? Like those small things, nitty gritty things. Your whip has all the time in their speech to be able to do that, but you don't. Your role here is to provide an identity for your team. And if you focus too much on rebutting the small things of the speeches of your diagonal, you might fail at providing your team's identity. So rebuttals are still highly, highly important at member, but it's more on what kinds of rebuttals do you prioritize. And I would advise that the kinds of rebuttals that you prioritize are the ones that are like the reframing type, the killing the assumptions type, and more on really exposing the failure of your opponent in terms of like framing assumptions and logic, but not the nitty gritty part of their speech. Okay, so that's what you do at member. Um, you don't obsess too much over rebuttals that are small. You do it minimally, but do it big. Okay, so um, that's my advice for rebutting your diagonal. Next, if you're closing opposition, so closing opposition has an added nuance. You need to rebut two different themes because you're already rebutting opening government, you're also rebutting closing government. So that's three speakers all together with different arguments from each other. So that's a harder, um, I mean, it's not harder because you have more time, but then in terms of absorbing many things to respond to, you have a higher burden. So when member of government is speaking, so that's the other closing team, at that point, if you are a member of opposition, you should already have been able to build your speech and formulate rebuttals against OG. So when MG is speaking, you shouldn't be making rebuttals against OG anymore because you've had all the time in the round to think of rebuttals against OG. So when your MG is already speaking, what you focus on is their speech. Do the same as the instruction above, like do not write everything word for word. Um, get the fatal assumption, respond to that. But just remember, if ever you become a member of opposition, when your closing government is already speaking, you should have been done with all the things you need to talk about at opening. You're already on the focus of the closing team. So meaning you need to take your like no, you have to be strategic about how you manage your time before closing half happens when you're a member of opposition. Um, you need to know in the middle of the round when to focus on OG, when to focus on OO, and then when already MG speaking, you're already focused on the closing half and you're able to prepare your speech. Now, again, very important in the middle of the round, communicate with your whip. If you are going to drop things that were initially agreed as important, you have to tell your whip. It's okay for you to make decisions like that. You have to tell your whip because it's going to be hard for them to whip if they have an assumption that you're going to talk about something and then you didn't talk about it in your speech. You're going to give them a hard time. And please don't give your whips a hard time because they have a very big role in the debate as well. So the way for you to not give each other a hard time is to communicate. Secondly, if you also suddenly thought of a new angle in the middle of the round, tell your whip. Explain to them in simple language in the middle of the round. Like maybe in your prep, you were able to think of five arguments, but then in the middle of the round, when you started hearing PM and LO, you suddenly had a very bright idea, and that's what you wanted to run. So you have to tell your whip about that. Thirdly, if you think a particular idea needs to be focused on, tell your whip. This usually happens after your own speech, like you've already been able to give your member speech and you think that there's a certain part of your frame that needs to be emphasized at whip, then tell them. Um, lastly, if you think that your whip or if your whip gives you a suggestion, try as much as possible to discuss it with them and incorporate that in your speech because again, you trust them. They also see the round in a different way that you do because they have a different role. And if they have their own diagnosis of what could be the best thing to do in your entrance in the debate, then go ahead and discuss it with them and do it, incorporate them in your speech. And again, as I said earlier, and I can't emphasize this enough, debate is a team sport and you are not on your own. Now, let's go to the meta-analysis at member. So you guys already know what meta-analysis is at deputy, but how do you do this against, how do you do this if you're a closing team, specifically if you're a member? How do you meta against your opening? Um, Firstly, be very careful not to knife them. A lot of rounds have been lost because of knifing their opponent or their opening. So please don't knife. Um, so what you can do instead is firstly delineate. So like I said earlier, 3 points of delineation somewhere at the beginning of your speech. Maybe after your introduction, that's where you explicitly tell the judge that this is what makes us different. This is our identity. And then in rounds where your frames or arguments tend to feel a bit similar to your opening, sometimes that really happens. Maybe you really are having arguments under the same frame, right? What you do in rounds like that is you explicitly emphasize the parts of your argument, the parts of your analysis, and the parts of your conclusions that you think are completely unique. You don't let the judge be the one to figure that out. You tell it to them yourself. Again, you have to be very explicit in spelling things out for them, or else they might not be able to plan. So you could say things like this. For example, this is your analysis. And then you follow it up with a sentence saying that this is a crucial piece of analysis, which, by the way, was completely missed by our opening. So you are comparing yourself to your opening when you are doing your own analysis. And that's meta debating. That's you talking about the debate and not just your own argument. You're not just arguing, you are showing to the judge that this is how you win. So another way to do it is, let's say you have an analysis, and then you can say after that, this mechanization is important because it explains to you why X actor would resort to such behavior. Therefore, all of the harms presented to you by our opening will only happen with the new analysis that we provided. Therefore, it should be credited to us. So you're saying that this added piece of analysis that we gave is what your opening lacked. And that's what explained why an actor would behave a certain way. And since that explanation was missing from your opening, you are convincing the judge that it should be credited to you. All of the impact should be credited to you because you're the only one who gave the reason as to why that impact will actually happen. Okay? Number three, you can add, for example, impacts. Mm, your opening missed certain impacts, then you mention those impacts, and then you can follow it up with a sentence saying, this is how catastrophic the results or the outcomes are going to be. Opening only went as far as saying blah, blah, blah. So you mentioned the low impact things that your opening said. But only we told you how grave the harms will be on the people. And we established the real urgency of the problem. Okay? So that you make a really good side-by-side comparison that your team was the one who was able to provide how bad the impacts are. And then you compare it to what your opening said. So you're not knifing them because you're not contradicting them, but you're making a comparison that sure we agree that they were able to give some impacts, but that's not the extent of the impacts. Only we gave you the full extent of why those impacts will be catastrophic. And that's how you explicitly compare yourself with your opening. Now, let's talk about the other bench, not your same bench anymore. So, for example, if you're CG, you're going to um, respond to the whole opposition team, right? Again, as I said, do not fixate on the nitty-gritty rebuttals. Respond to the big ideas, especially if you're a member of opposition. If you're a member of opposition, you need to respond to two different government teams. So you need to leave the surgical responses to the whip, because you won't have time to respond to so many people at the same time. So immediately also tackle the damage and the strong frame from the other bench. Otherwise, your whip will have a hard time. Again, the same strategy that I always tell you guys when it comes to rebuttals. If you notice that the other team was able to damage your team completely, especially if you're a member of opposition, you have to really recover from that. Because if you're not able to recover from that, if you're not able to respond from that, your whip is going to be having a difficult time. Okay. Next, if you're a member, important to pressure the next speaker. Give some burden pushes. Like, if they don't respond to this, or if they don't justify as to blah, 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 then they cannot win the debate. Or if they don't give us an explanation as to why this is more important than this, if they don't weigh the importance of this, blah, 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 then you cannot credit their arguments. You have to be communicative to the judge like that. Okay? Burden pushing. So you're not just communicating to the judge, you're also pressuring the other team that, oh no, you're gonna make them feel like, I'm gonna have to answer that burden push or else I'm gonna look like I'm unengaging. Right? You're gonna give that kind of vibe. Next, again, as I said, intros are very important. It would be it would be much better to have this written again verbatim. The intro should be clear, should be done with intent. Again, it's your shield, your weapon, and above all, especially if you're closing, it's your identity. It's like, imagine that you are in a completely, you're in a room full of strangers and you're going to come in and introduce yourself. That's going to be your first impression. That's kind of what I imagine members are like. You have to leave that lasting impression. You have to leave a good first impression and a lasting impression because that's who you are as a team. And you're not carrying just your own identity, you're carrying the identity of your entire team, of your entire um um group, right? So if you remember, that's the burden that you have, and you have to fulfill that. And you can fulfill that with a very good intro that has a lot of intent. Okay. And lastly, these are the things that you should avoid. I already mentioned this earlier. Value neutral things in your intro. Most important thing about member speeches is number one, it should be a balance of these two things. Why are we different? And what makes this difference important enough to win, or important or enough to win the debate? It shouldn't just be one or the other. So again, if you are panicking and you are out of whatever thing to say at member, just always remember these two important questions. What makes us different? And why is that difference important in winning the debate? And if you are able to answer that question, your member speech is good to go. Those two questions, rather. You can't just answer one. Sometimes there's a lot of members who are so good in saying that they're different, that we have 3 points of delineation. We are so different from our opening, and they were not able to say this and that and this and that. But if you did not explain why that difference makes your team winnable, then you still have a chance at not winning the debate. So you have to explain to the judges what makes that difference so good. Because if not, they can still buy what your opening said, that they're still this is still the most important value. So even if you're different, it doesn't matter. You're still not important. So you have to really defend why you're different and why you're the most important. That is something that should be clear all throughout your speech, not just in one part of your speech, not just in your rebuttals, not just in your argument, but in the entirety of your speech. It should be clear that you are different, and that difference is so important in making you win because that's what establishes who you are as a team, and that's what establishes your identity. And so, in order for you to give a winning member speech, as I said, it's not just enough to prove the delineation. It's equally important to prove that the delineation has value and is the most valuable thing in the debate. Okay? Now, again, as suggested time management thing, just to police yourself if you're going over time or like you're not able to provide much um, focus or investment on a certain part of your speech. 0 to 1:30, if you're a member of government, do your intro, make your delineations. 1:30 to 3, rebut OO. You're only rebutting OO this time. But if you want, you can also have preemptions against CO here. 3 to 6:45, extend. 6:45 to 7:30, conclude and seal. Next, if you're MO, the only difference is the time management when it comes to rebutting the other bench. You have to be able to rebut OG and CG, right? But again, this can vary because sometimes you have a stronger OG team compared to a CG. So maybe you can use more time to rebut OG and maybe just a few like seconds to rebut CG. And vice versa. If CG is much stronger, you focus more your rebuttals on them and just quickly make one or two rebuttals against opening government. So it's you also making that kind of prioritization in your head when it comes to time management. But almost the same thing when it comes to time management for a member of opposition. So now that we know what should the thought processes be as a member of government or member of op, we now go to the strategies on how we can extend and um, somehow like the frameworks of extending as a member. So it's still extensions, but different from extending at deputy. So um, it's better that we clear that out now. So there's two ways to extend when you're a member or when you're in a closing team. Um, First is you can deepen the debate. The second is you can widen the debate. When we say deepen the debate, it's usually what judges call vertical extension. Vertical because it's much more related to what your opening said. But widening the debate is called a horizontal extension. It's more of providing more contexts to the debate. Let's talk about each of these. So deepening the debate is what you do when you add missing pieces of analysis or impacts that your opening half missed. And it's a strategy that happens more often. Sometimes it's not your fault. Sometimes you really have like limited contexts for the debate that you just need to ride on the frame of your opening, right? Sometimes it really just happens. Um, and you are kind of following their frame, but you just give more analysis, give more impacts, but you're under the same umbrella basically. But the danger of deepening the debate is that you might be accused as rehashing your opening. So if your strategy is to deepen the debate, what you need to do is to double your efforts in delineation. So you have to be very, very explicit on why your delineation and why it's important, so that you don't look like you're rehashing or hijacking your opponent at opening. So that's deepening the debate. Again, that's vertical extension. Now, what about the other way to extend? The other way is to widen the debate, which is called horizontal extension. What you do here is you provide a completely new perspective or angle to the debate that no other team has touched upon just yet. So, um, that means you're not completely riding on the frame of your opening, but you're not knifing them. It's just you're having a completely new perspective or new big idea. This is more aligned with the thing I mentioned earlier on thinking of a winning frame. So it's usually a horizontal extension when you try to think of a winning frame. This is more difficult because it requires you to have more knowledge, requires you to have a more adaptable sense of thinking when it comes to debate, and really, you really need to have the guts to kind of separate yourself from your opening. So it's more difficult, but sometimes it can be very, very strategic because you are able to establish an actual identity that's so different from everybody else in the round. But the disadvantage of this is sometimes you can have the danger of being boxed out. So here, so that you don't look like you're an isolated team from the whole debate, you need to double your efforts in justifying why the new angle that you provided is the most relevant angle in the debate. Okay, so that's the difference between the two. Now, here are some extension frameworks on member. Number one, new context, new problem, or new goal. So, what you do here is you tell the judge that the opening half completely missed an important problem. that should have been tackled in the debate. You can tell the judge that this new context is able to change the urgency of the motion, or you tell the judge that this new goal is the most important thing in the debate. So this new context is what changes things. And since they didn't talk about this, since opening didn't talk about this, then we are able to establish that this is our importance. So given this first framework, let's say the motion is this House prefers a US led climate action initiative over a China led one. And you're closing government. You prefer US instead of China. So maybe your opening already talked about why um US is like they have the resources, they have the priorities, and China is one of the most um what do you call this? Like the top um um top polluter, like one of the top polluters in the world, and that makes them an illegitimate like leader in climate action and all that stuff. Maybe your opening talked about that. But you can tell the judges that they completely missed the context that the Communist Party of China or the people governing China right now are the ones who are like very closely tied or possibly even like the owners of actual organizations that have interests to continue polluting because a lot of their profits are gained from um doing environmentally like unfriendly things, and those people are the ones who are at the seats of governing China, meaning this adds a new urgency to the problem. We absolutely cannot have China leading this climate action initiative precisely because there's a conflict of interest, because their very leaders are the people who will try as much as possible not to to do climate action in the purest and the fullest extent, because that's against their corporate or like um their business interests, right? And if you were able to add that new context, the judges will be very much convinced that hell no, it cannot be China, because not only are they bad polluters, but literally the initiatives will not be fulfilled and will not be implemented in the most effective way because the very leaders of those initiatives might be against climate action initiatives and mistakes, right? So that's a good way to add that new context, and add a new identity to your team. You're able to establish an urgency by providing new matter to the debate, right? That's just basically what it is. Sometimes it's a new problem that you're providing, sometimes you're also providing a new goal. Next, what you can do as a member is to provide a new characterization. So maybe your opening half has characterized actors in the motion extensively, but even with their extensive characterization, they missed who those actors really are as persons. So you can explain why the nature of a character or an actor is likely to lead them to behave a certain way. It's very useful in breaking down deadlocks and outcomes claimed by the opening half. And it also this is and what you do is you prove why this characterization is necessary for certain impacts to be credited. Say for example, the motion is in the context of a post-pandemic world, this house believes that it's within the interest of pandemic graduates to opt into a flexible work schedule that pays less as opposed to a demanding work culture that pays more. Basically, you have to prove why this pandemic graduate would rather be paid less but have a better work flexibility and work life balance compared to um, being in the office 9 to 5, no, not just 9 to 5, but you're going overtime. But you do get lots of pay, like so much pay, and you have to prove why they would rather have the flexible schedule. So maybe your opening has talked about why the pandemic graduate cares about mental health. The pandemic graduate cares about um like work life balance and having time for themselves, especially after the pandemic when people were able to think about their priorities. Maybe it's not the money and all that. Maybe that's what your opening half had a back and forth about. Maybe opening opposition was like, no, they don't care about the work life balance as much. They care about money because pandemic graduates think about the long term. They want to be financially secure. So there's a push and pull in opening government and opening opposition on what really the pandemic graduates care about. So judges are now left to solve that kind of deadlock. Like, yeah, whatever. What do they care about, right? So as closing government, you can enter and say that um, pandemic graduates care both about financial security and also about mental health and work-life balance. And we don't disagree with opening half on that push and pull. But what we think that these pandemic graduates care the most about is having agency and the choice for themselves. So now that's a very different characterization of who these pandemic graduates really are. You can say that because historically of the pandemic, they were able to realize that they have a choice. They're not just like slaves to capitalism or slaves to the real world or to the adulthood. They actually have a choice to themselves. They have agency to pick. And the reason why a pandemic graduate would rather have a flexible work schedule is because the flexible work schedule is the one that makes them feel like they have that agency, is the one that makes them practice that agency the most. So sure, now you are able to break that deadlock. Like sure, they like money and they like mental health, but they're able to get both money and mental health in a flexible work schedule because of the characterization that they are people who care the most about their agency. Right? Now that's completely different from your opening. It's a new characterization that could give you a winning frame in the debate. Next framework, you can also talk about a new actor. Now you have to think, is there an important actor that has not yet been discussed by the opening half? This is a framework that can also be used in deputy. I discussed this earlier, but of course, you can also use it as member. Sometimes the debate is so like heavily focused on institutions and organizations and all these other people, but then they didn't really talk about some actors that will be heavily affected by the debate. So now you ask yourself, if there's that actor that they missed. And if you're going to take this route, the advice that I have is always make sure that you compare this against all the other actors that have been mentioned in the debate. And you have to prove why your actor is most important. So, for example, if your opening half talked about corporations and the government and all of that, and you decide to talk about ethnic minorities, you don't just say that, okay, we're the team who will talk about ethnic minorities. You also say that the ethnic minorities are the most important because blah, 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 blah. And they're more important than the government because blah, blah. They're more important than the corporations because blah, 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 blah. So you have an explicit comparison to all other actors mentioned in the debate. So, motion example. The South believes that developing countries should embrace trade liberalization, and you are closing opposition. So trade liberalization, for those who don't know, it's basically when like there's more freedom and liberalism when it comes to trading. There's lesser tariffs, there's lesser regulations. So one country can trade with another without much payment to be done. And like all that trade is just basically very easy. Like it's there's not much restrictions on it from one country to another. Now you're closing opposition and you're against this. You don't think that developing countries should embrace trade liberalization. Perhaps your opening half talked about why it's bad for the companies of developing countries because they might close down, they might be replaced by multinational companies, and the economy like the own products, like your self-made products are not going to flourish. Colonial mentality is going to get worse, and the people there are going to have a difficult time because the prices are gonna be higher, like there's more imported goods than there are local goods. And we have, when we discourage the production of local things and stuff like that. Maybe your opening focused more on that. But you can think of a new actor. Maybe it's not just all about the corporations. Maybe it's also all about minorities, indigenous and ethnic minorities. How is that possible? At CO, you can say that trade liberalization is something we'll never stand for, because things like these are what causes the displacement of indigenous people. Especially for developing countries with all of these ethnic minorities, they have the ability to thrive because of their own natural resources and their own communities in those places if we invest on them. But if we invest in trade liberalization, that means there's going to be more infrastructure coming from other countries. There's going to be more businesses that are um, made in the forests that were once homes of indigenous people. There's going to be more urbanization. There's going to be more industrialization, and that could imply and that could mean that indigenous people who have these places as their sacred homes, they're going to be displaced and driven away from those places. And as a developing country, those are the very people that you should protect and invest in, because they're the only ones who, like, keep the identity of your country. But if you um put them at a disadvantage with trade liberalization, then the country is going to go to, it's going to be doomed. So that's a very different extension. Your opening focused a lot on like economics and things, and you don't disagree with them. You think that's important, but you say that there are more important people that we need to look at if trade liberalization is going to happen. And it's these people who have been disadvantaged for decades already and centuries. And that's how you frame it. Like, and now you're able to provide a novel extension as well. Okay. Next, again, same with deputy sometimes, right? You can look at the micro and macro scale. You can talk about the long-term, short-term effects. So if opening talked about smaller scale, try to explore the societal, community, or international level. But if opening talked about larger effects, talk about why it's important to include the individual the most. So you just really have to make um, efforts in weighing why is the individual more important than the society, why is society more important than the individual. So that's what makes the extensions at member different. If you're a deputy, you have to explain why both long-term and short-term effects are important and they make your team complete. But if you are a member making an extension on micro and macro scale, you have to compare them and why your focus is much more important than your openings. If your opening talk about short term, you talk about long term, and you explain why those are the most important effects that need to be considered in the round. So here's an example of a motion. This House believes that feminist movement should never adopt the fight for men's rights. So you're against adopting that fight for men's rights in the narrative of the feminist movement. You're closing government, and you are um against this, the fight for men's rights. Your opening probably talked about how um it's bad for the feminist movement as a whole because there's bad optics. It doesn't like it doesn't follow the original principles of the feminist movement, because, like, men are naturally like the men in the patriarchal society are the naturally the reasons why the feminist movement existed, so it's weird to fight for men's rights, and that's what your opening is going to talk about. And as a closing theme, you can talk about how this fight for men's rights can affect a little girl who hears all of these narratives, why it could be so bad for the individual little girl who has experienced perhaps some level of assault from men or all the microaggressions of being a woman, and her hearing that the feminist movement, the very movement who tries to fight for women's rights, is also um fighting for rights of the very people who created that society, patriarchal society that caused her pain. So now you are zooming in into the story of this young girl, and you justify it by saying that the feminist movement exists because of these very individuals, because of the stories of these young girls in the first place. And its goal is to make sure that the future of these young girls will be not as bleak as the present that we have right now. And that's how you justify that this is all about the individual. Sure, it's about a group, but the group in itself, the essence of the group, is about the individual. So that's how you do the comparison when it comes to micro and macro scale. And then another framework at member could be the comparative. So if all else fails, if opening teams fall under the trap of battling which are the good and the bad effects of the motion, it's the perfect time to provide like a counterfactual or a comparative, and you build it structurally and prove why it's likely. It's very important in regrets motions. So example, if you have a motion, this house regrets the dominance of liberal feminism and in contemporary feminist discourse. Um, and you're closing opposition, meaning you are okay that liberal feminism is more dominant than other types of feminism like radical feminism, um, and all those other kinds of feminism. And you are okay that liberal feminism is the one dominating that discourse. Maybe your opposing bench, maybe government side says that, oh, if liberal feminism was not dominant, then other types of feminism would have been dominant. It could have been radical feminism we're talking about. It could have been more anal like we could have been analyzing more on why feminism is related to class and your social standing in society, instead of liberal feminism being all about like girl boss and all that, right? Maybe they said that that's the counterfactual, but you can disagree. In your extension, you can say that the counterfactual that the government team provided is actually not what's likely to happen. What's likely to happen if liberal feminism did not dominate the discourse is that the stronger narratives of the patriarchy, they're the ones who are going to dominate feminist discourse, because the other types of feminism have low buy-in in the first place. There's not a lot of people who support radical feminism, for example, or Marxist feminism, for example. The reason why we're okay with liberal feminism because that is because at least there's a type of feminism that actually comes from women themselves, and like um they're the ones controlling the narrative. But if liberal feminism was not dominant, what would have been dominant is not other types of feminist ideals. It's probably the like stigma stigma charged kind of discourse that came not from women but from superstructures like the patriarchy, talking about how women should still be in the kitchen and women should still be um, housewives and all that. So we prefer that liberal feminism is dominant instead of no feminism being dominant in feminist discourse at all. So you basically explained to the judges that they had a failed assumption. They assumed that other kinds of feminist discourse will be dominant if it was not liberal feminism. But the reality is, in the context of society, there's no way that other types of feminism would have been dominant compared to liberal feminism. So what's gonna dominate the narratives and the conversations will be these patriarchal superstructures that would still be very unbeneficial to women. So now you provided a different counterfactual that completely could open the eyes of the judges and make them lean towards your side. So basically, that ends the lecture on deputy and closing, specifically member. I hope that those very detailed um, lectures can help you guys with your speeches and your fears when it comes to becoming deputy and when it comes to becoming member. I tell you guys, it's been very difficult to overcome that. But once you have information on what you can do, what the strategies you can take, then it's gonna get easier and easier. And of course, that will need you guys to practice a lot. So please do train. Um, if you're going to want to apply all of these things. So it's already 11:44, but I have one last lecture to provide, and it's a different context now because earlier we were talking about British parliamentary positions, right? But this time we're going to talk about an Asian parliamentary position, which is the reply speech. So I'll try my best to finish this by 12 so that I won't take up too much time from your lunch. But if we do get overtime a little bit, I apologize in advance. But this is a much shorter lecture. That's what I can say. Because these are just tips on how to give reply speeches when you are doing AP debating. So all reply speeches are the game changers of Asian parliamentary debating. Sometimes rounds are won because of reply speeches. And that's why I want you guys to appreciate as well how important reply speeches are. Because sometimes there's a connotation or an assumption that, oh, it's already the reply speech, the round is already over. Um, a speaker saying some additional stuff. But actually, that's not true. In high level, sometimes reply speeches are the clinchers. So you guys to if you guys are reply speakers or if you ever find yourselves being assigned to do the reply, I want you guys to know the value of it and how much it can do to change the game. Just a quick recap of AP debating. The reply speaker is actually someone who's already given the speech, only possibly either the first speaker or the second speaker. So if you're a PM or DPM or LO or DLO, you're the ones who are likely to be assigned as the reply speaker. If you're the whip, you're not gonna give a reply. And this is how the structure goes at AP, if you guys can remember. They are the ones who give like a 4 minute speech, 4 minute speech at the end of after the whips have been given their speeches. There's only just a bit of a deviation here. After opposition whip is opposition reply, so it's not zigzag there. And then after opposition reply is government reply. And as you guys know, it's around 4 minutes and 30 seconds for a speech. So what's a reply speech? You've probably heard this so many times, but I will say it again. It's a biased adjudication. You have around 4 minutes and 15 seconds. You're not allowed to give POIs to reply speaker, so please don't make that mistake, or you might get called out by the judge. And the other good thing about the reply speech is that because you don't have POIs there, you have absolute control over your speech. Um, Whatever you say there, nobody will interrupt you unless you say something that's beyond the bounds of equity, right? Like it might be, or if something like extreme happens. But technically, if you're a reply speaker, that is your time. You don't need to hear POIs from other people or people saying POI, and you have to say sit, or whatever. But yeah, again, that's what a reply speech is. And another thing I want to emphasize here is that reply speeches are not whip speeches. Um, they have a bit of similarity, but not entirely. And you are not rebutting. You're not allowed to rebut that reply. You are talking about the debate in reply. You're not giving arguments at reply. You are talking about the arguments that transpired in the debate at reply. So, what's the purpose of a reply speech? After the 4 minutes and 15 seconds of your speech, of your reply speech, the purpose of the speech is that the judge should no longer doubt your win. So every time you're going to give a reply speech, you have to have that mindset that after I've given the speech, I should have convinced the judge that there's no way the opponent will win. I should have convinced the judge that this team is the winner, is the one that will get the point. So again, it's not just some extra speech where you summarize. Some people think that reply speeches are just summaries, like opponent said this, we said this, they rebutted this, and blah blah blah. It's not like that. Reply speeches are strategic, and I would say one of the speeches that need absolute, like, really, really good strategy, because you don't just reiterate the parts of the debate. Rather, it's to remove all the possibilities of the judge thinking that you have some leeway to lose. So always remember that that's your purpose if you're a reply speaker. In your mind, you think whatever the judge thinks could be the reason why we lose. I will remove all that. I will be the one to like extract that from their head. Maybe they think that I'm losing because the opponent said this rebuttal. This reply speech is going to take that out of their head right now. So that's how you frame reply speeches in your head. So that when you make your speeches, you don't just make a speech for the sake of making a speech, but you make a speech so that you remove all of that doubt from the judges. So it's you communicating to the judge. You're no longer communicating to the debaters in the round. You are already kind of making a pitch to the judge that your team is the winner. So what is the format of the reply speech? The format is that there are none. No fixed format. Some people think that there are, but there's not. Let's go back to this. Some people would say um, the reply speech would be good if it has standards. Like, these are the standards on how the debate should be judged. Is it issues? Like, will it follow the issues that were used by the whip? Or should you answer some questions of the debate that were not answered? Or should it just be free flowing? The answer to that is that it's up to you. It's up to your style. There's no fixed format, because the overall intent and the overall goal of a reply speech is to just convince the judge that you win. And if it means you need to have standards that works for you, to say that these are the standards of the debate, like responsiveness and blah blah blah, and we were the more the responsive team. If that's what works for you, then use that. If issues work for you in proving that you won the debate, then use that. If it means answering questions of the debate, use that. It really is up to your discretion, as long as your intent and your goal is to really make the judge think that you are the winner. I can't emphasize that enough. So it's so much easier to say though than to do, to convince the judge that you won. But how do I make a good reply speech then? How do I actually do it when I'm already there? Two things that I want to emphasize all the time. It's two C's. It's confidence and content. So these two need to have a balance of each other. Number one, confidence. You are the last speaker of your team, and the moment that it is clear in your speech that you feel like you're not winning, judges are going to feel that and they're going to be less convinced. So, theatrics are still so important in debate, especially in reply. Because the whole point of your existence as a reply speaker is to tell the judge that you're winning and convince them that you're winning. But if you're not convinced yourself because you're not confident in delivering that speech, then you have just given the judge more reason to not make you win. So you have to believe it yourself. And I know that's sometimes hard if you think that in the round you weren't able to respond as much, you weren't able to fully make a good argument in your team. But at that moment, you have to have some level of slight delusion, for lack of a better term. You have to have that level of delusion that would kind of eliminate all that doubt in your own head that you are gonna lose. So I'm not saying that you should be overconfident to the point that you forgot that um your team had faults. But the thing is, you don't mention your faults in the reply. You just mention all the good things that your team was able to do at reply, right? Um, it really is a pitch. It's really a like you convincing and negotiating your win. So you have to be confident, but you don't go too overconfident to the point that the judge is gonna see through that delusion, right? So don't get too absorbed in your team's mistakes, because that's something you do after the round. Like, you only process mistakes together and how you can improve after the round. But when you're in the middle of the round, your goal is still to win because you haven't won until the oral adjudication is finished, right? Like it's not over until it's over. You haven't won and you haven't lost. So that means at your reply speech, you have a chance to win. There's no, like, you don't have zero chances. And that means your speech is the final speech that's going to take all of those chances for you to win. Like, try, it's the one part that you have so much control over in terms of influencing the judge's decision. So confidence is so important. Like as much as possible, try to work on like your stuttering, work on like the tone of your voice and the shaking and all that. Um, it's something that you can get better at through practice and through more tournaments you can join. Um, but once you master the art of being confident in reply, it's also much easier to think of why you win. It's also much easier to actually win. Um, but if you get too absorbed by your mistakes, it's harder for you to think of what you did well in, right? So be confident but objective. Next, the letter C that's also equally as important is content. No amount of confidence can make up for empty content. So there have been some reply speeches that, you know, full of confidence and really good manner of speaking. But if you look at it even deeper, it doesn't necessarily strategically tell the judges why your team is deserving of a win. So content is just as important. Of course, your reply speech was good if you did well in the round, right? So being good in the round is going to be very helpful to the reply speakers too. It's just that the reply speaker should have a good sense of picking which parts of the round to emphasize in the content of that reply speech, um, so that the judges will be more convinced. So now it's easy to say that content is important, but then how exactly do we identify what my reply speech should contain? So here are some of the advice that I have for people doing reply when it comes to content. Number one, one of the things that like good reply speeches have would be motion analysis. So what do I mean by this? Sometimes you just have to look back at the motion and just think again to yourself. Did my opponent really fulfill their burden? So for example, it's an actor motion and the motion is all about defending the perspective of an actor. And then you realize, wait a minute, my opponent didn't really talk much about the perspective of that actor. They just talked about the benefits and the harms of that thing that affects the actor. They didn't link it to why the actor would behave a certain way. Then mention that in the reply. You can say that the reason why our team is going to win is because we were the team who truly debated in the spirit of the motion. This is an actor debate. It can't be a debate about why unschooling, for example, why unschooling is good or bad. Only our team um, argued to you why parents themselves would prefer to not unschool their children. But the other team focused too much on just the benefits of and harms of unschooling, which means in terms of who truly debated this motion with its spirit, it's our team who did it. So motion analysis. Maybe in regrets motions as well. Regrets motions should have a requirement for government teams to provide a counterfactual. And if you just sit down and think for a minute, wait, they said that this particular thing they're regretting is bad, but they never gave us the counterfactual. They never gave us what would have happened in the world without that thing they're regretting. But that's the one requirement of a regrets motion, which they did not do. So you say that in your reply speech. So the judge will be like, right, you're right. Like they did not fulfill their burden. And that can make you win. Right? So sometimes no matter how like unbuilt some of your arguments are, if you're able to um kind of make the judge view the debate in a way that the other team was completely irrelevant or was unable to fulfill their burden. Even if your team had some imperfections, they could even make you win. So yeah, that's one. Number two, attack their analysis or the substantiation, especially in main points of contention. So this doesn't mean you're gonna rebut. You're not gonna say this is untrue because blah blah blah. This is illogical because blah blah blah. Because you had all the time in the debate to do that. But what I mean here is that if you attack their analysis, you talk about how they said this, but under that they provide zero explanation as to why that is true. So you're just kind of saying that, oh, they didn't fulfill their burden to actually explain that rebuttal. And then you tell the judge that since they didn't explain that rebuttal, then that's not going to take down our argument. That's it. Like, you're explaining what happened in the debate. You're explaining that their analysis lacked. And because their analysis lacked, their substantiation lacked, what does that mean for the debate? And that means you're going to win, right? You can always um, say that. Number three, you can analyze that the harms and benefits that they claimed do not accrue. And you could say that by firstly mentioning your rebuttals. Maybe your team was able to rebut quite well against a benefit that they claim. And you reference which rebuttals were so important in taking down or damaging their team. And then you conclude that because we were able to mention this, then the benefit that they claim is never going to happen. Therefore, you cannot credit that judge. So there, you can say that in the reply speech. Um, you can also mention that our team was actually able to steal and co-opt all of their benefits, and all their harms are not mutually exclusive. So you could mention to the judges that actually they said so many benefits, but we get those benefits too. And we explained that through deputy speech. During our first speaker, we already preempted that. So you're basically again pitching that in terms of what happened in the debate, we should actually win. And then point out your strongest points that were unresponded to. This is also very important at reply. If you have very, very good points coming from your first speakers or even from you when you spoke, and you notice that the other team kind of just dropped that or didn't um, try to respond to it, they ignored it, it's very important to mention that in reply. Um, and you can even be creative and say that, oh, it was conveniently ignored by the other team, perhaps because they know that this is a like this is something that rebutted their argument quite well, right? But it has to stand because it was not responded to, and you talk about why that's a winning argument. And then also you can attack their responses. Maybe you could mention that as much as they did try to respond to us, their responses were convenient because they didn't really tackle this. They didn't really try to disprove that. It does not really completely disprove our argument because this and that. So now again, you're making an assessment of what happened in the debate in terms of what their responses were. And you make a comparison. Why were our responses better? Our responses were better because it directly responded to this claim, or it directly responded to this frame, it directly responded to this assumption. And because we broke that down, that assumption down, then we have to win. So if you notice, the line of content that you have in reply speeches is that there's also a lot of meta debating. In fact, reply is more on meta debating. It's debating about the debate. It's talking about what happened in the debate. It's no longer arguing. It's no longer rebutting for the motion. It's really pitching why you win. Here are other ways that you can add content to your reply speech. Parallelisms and demonstrations. So, for example, your opponent has an argument, um, and you can liken it to a certain um, demonstration or parallelism. So maybe I don't I think one line that I've heard or like I think said before is like um that's like telling a young girl to stop dreaming, something like that. It's just a creative way to do it. Like maybe the motion is all about like um about like something related to feminist movement, um like adopting a narrative that is more on caring, like adopting the narrative that being a housewife is okay, right? Because before, being a housewife was more derogatory coming from the patriarchy. And now if we have emotion about um uh if we have emotion about like um the feminist movement adopting the narrative that uh those traditional roles for women are okay, you can make some parallelisms like that uh at reply, just to kind of simplify the arguments for the judges, like their argument on why the feminist movement will be good for uh, like the feminist movement adopting traditional, or like accepting and promoting traditional women roles again, is gonna be good for young women. It's just like telling a young girl that they shouldn't dream to be a CEO and stuff like that, right? Just kind of those kinds of reframing as parallelisms can be done at reply. You could do this in your speeches as well, but in reply, I would say it's a good strategy because the debate has already been like complicated. There's been so many things that have been said. There's so many technical terms. There's so much rich discussion. Sometimes replies are the ones that simplify whatever happened in the debate in simple language for judges to understand the messy debate. And you could do this by providing parallelisms and demonstrations. Um, in reply, you can also mention POIs, maybe the lack of engagement of the other team in your POI, or maybe the response to your POI that wasn't good enough. You can mention that. When we ask in a POI, blah, 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 and their response to it was this. And that response is not effective because blah, blah, blah. You can do that. And very good thing to do in reply as well is point out some contradictions. So you're no longer rebutting. You're just saying that, wait, first speaker said this, and then their whip said this. I don't think this makes sense for them to say that all at the same time. Um, it's inconsistent. You can point out those contradictions. And then things also you can mention, they only operated on their best case. So you're already having an analysis of the or assessment of how the other team worked. And then you notice that actually their arguments sound so good, but that's because they only operated on their best case. They never engaged on the worst possible case that could happen to them. And we've been pushing all throughout the round that this is the worst case that could happen to their team. They never engaged to it. And that's why we're the team who's going to win because we operated on our absolute worst case. So you make a comparison as well. And also say things like, we were the team who engaged on the multiple frames of the debate. We engaged on the other team's frame, which the other team didn't try to do for us. So we were the more adaptive team. We were the team who was able to tell you that in whatever scenario, we should still follow this motion. Something like that. And another thing, and lastly, you could say in reply is that even if none of the benefits that we told you are going to happen or are going to accrue, at the end of the day, our principle still stands, right? Or vice versa. Even if um, you don't buy our principle, the fact that we have these practical benefits on our side is something that cannot be denied, and it's something that's very important, and that's why we should win. So you are also doing a lot of weighing here, and you are doing a lot of like um engagement in saying that, sure, let's pretend that none of the things we said are actual real life benefits, but the fact that it was our team who told you that the principle is the most important thing, then that means our team is still going to win. Conversely, the other team did not give you any principle at all. So that's something you can mention and reply to. Okay. And I think we're at the last few slides. Your reply is your defense. So think of replies as a shield, as a force field, or as a bulletproof vest. Um, because it's your way to kind of minimize the damage that the other team has done to you throughout the debate. You are shielding your teammates from um, the possibility that the judge thinks you will lose. So it is urgent then to answer some dangerous accusations. So, for example, at WHIP, some of them said that, oh, there was a contradiction from first speaker and second speaker. So if you get an accusation like that, make sure to answer at reply. No, there was no contradiction. That's a false accusation. And you explain why. So you have to answer that at reply. So if there's also an accusation from the other team that the analysis was not sufficient, you have to say in reply, actually, our analysis was sufficient because we said this, we said this, we said this. So answer those questions. And then sometimes there are also accusations saying that they were building at WHIP. You hear that a lot, right? So you have to answer that in reply because those accusations are things that judges love to hear and they take note of them. So for you to defend yourself from those, you have to answer them at reply. Like it's unfortunate that the opposition whip accused us that our whip was building because that's not true. Our whip was merely providing a response to the analysis that blah blah blah. So at least you're able to address those at the end. If there's a reframe in the speech of your opponent, address that right away. This debate is about XYZ, right? If the whip was so good and they were able to change the direction of the debate to their frame, your reply speech can still do a reframe, but just make use of the material that was already in the debate. We told you that this debate is about XYZ because you have heard coming from my PM speech that blah, blah, blah. And we also were consistent throughout all the other speeches that this is the most important thing. So don't listen to the opposition whip who said that this debate is about something else. Something like that. You can say that in reply. So some do's and don'ts at reply speech as well. Do explicitly say why you won. Do add extra framing or some weighing to the issues. Um, do address core questions of the debate and be selective of what you will address. You can't address everything because you only have 4 minutes, so be selective. But do not add new arguments or rebuttals. Do not unfairly represent the opponent's material. Do not spend too much time re explaining arguments because your teammates already did that, right? You don't need to add more explanation to the arguments because that might not help you win. Then don't feel like you need to address every single clash or every single argument. Just the main ones that you think still give you some room to use. So really, if you're a strategic reply speaker, you're already thinking of okay, what are the ways we can lose in this debate? I'm gonna be the one addressing that so that there's none of that left after my speech. Okay? And lastly, and most importantly, you need integrity if you're a reply speaker or if you're a debater in general. Integrity is so important. So please do not lie in your reply speeches. You can, you know, have extra emphasis on some of the good things that you guys did do in your speeches, but do not lie. Especially during close or contentious rounds, do not overinflate your contributions and don't undercredit your opponent because that can shoot yourself in the foot. So make sure to be generous and take the risk of acknowledging that your opponents did good things. You don't need to lie and say that, oh, they were just completely bad. No, you don't need to do that, especially in good rounds, because that adds integrity to the debate, right? Or maintains the integrity rather. So you can acknowledge that as much as their rebuttal was a good rebuttal, or as much as we appreciate the argument of our opponent on this, you can still have a way of framing that it's still not winnable, right? They were able to um, explain this and that, and we admire them for it. You can even say that we admire that the opposing team was able to do this, but they cannot win with just that because blah blah blah, right? That's what you can do. Immediately convince the judge why even if they were that good, it would not be enough to take it over your team. Okay? So because judges will be able to see through it if you just completely dismiss all of the good things that your opponent said. You can just like you can't say they're unengaging if they actually engaged and all that. Or you can't say that they didn't substantiate if they did substantiate, right? So make sure not to lie. So if you know that judges already know that they did substantiate, they did rebut quite well, you can acknowledge that in your reply. It's just that you find a way to still tell the judge that despite how good they were, they cannot win the debate. There's still reasons why our team was better. And that's what makes a very, very good reply speech. One that has integrity and respect for what happened in the round. So now, how can we change the game? How can reply speeches be a game changer? It can cement your win, especially in close rounds. So don't be scared of doing reply. I think you can even think of it as a role that's an honor to fulfill because it can cement your win. Sometimes rounds are just so close. It's just like it's really just one or the other whoever's going to win. So a reply speech can be the cementing factor. Number two, it can shift decisions, especially in close rounds. I've experienced judging a round that um where all this time I thought it was government who was gonna win, but after I heard the reply speech of opposition, it gave me a new perspective to the round because sometimes reply speeches who give you that perspective that you might have been missing as a judge. Um, and good reply speeches are able to shift decisions like that, especially in close rounds. Lastly, it also has the ability to affect speaker scores. Honestly, we've experienced that as well. Sometimes reply speeches reference to your speakers, right? Like, my prime minister was able to do this. My deputy prime minister is able to do that, and stuff like that. And sometimes being able to reference your partners um, and even yourself that way in emphasizing what you did well can actually make the judge think that, oh, right, that speech was good, let's give that person a 79, right? Or conversely, sometimes it can actually affect the speaker scores of your opponents. Maybe at first the judges thought that the opponent is like, oh, that's an 80 for me, and then the reply speech kind of gave a new perspective that actually that speech was the one that made a contradiction. So maybe it can make the speaker score even lower and even increase your chances of winning. So reply speeches have that power. It's a very, very powerful speech. And if you guys are also judging, I would encourage you guys to listen to reply speech because it's really well made. They're craftfully thought of and strategically thought of. It's a really good art. And that's why it's good to invest in it as well. And since you have absolute control over your speech, think of reply speeches as the speech with the most freedom. And that's how I also framed it to myself when I used to do reply speeches. I felt so free when I was doing replies. Some people are probably dreading reply speeches because, oh no, I need to give another second speech and I have very few time to make it and stuff like that. But actually, if you think about it, it's a very free speech. It's full of freedom. It feels liberating, I would even say. You have so much leeway for creativity. You can experiment on the words that you will be using, the strategies that you will be taking, your manner of delivery, your style, your format. Finding your own identity on how you can give reply speeches can make it even more impactful. Of course, you have to do it also within the bounds of equity. Obviously, that's not as something I need to say, but some people kasi they tend to be there's some tendency to be mean in reply speeches because of the freedom that it gives you, right? Sometimes people love being very sassy there. Um, that's okay. Like sassiness is okay and all that. Sometimes it adds theatrics and confidence, but of course, make sure that it doesn't the words that you use are not going to hurt other people. But it's very free. It's not like other speeches where, oh, you have to do rebuttals here and then you need to give two arguments and then you need to give impact. It's not like that. It's really you just thinking of what should I say so I can win the round. How do I say it? How can I creatively do it? It's really just so beautiful and so free. And that's why I absolutely loved giving reply speeches before. So I hope that you guys grow to love it as well. And last few tips that I have, don't try to cram too much in a four minute speech. Just pick the most urgent things to address. Again, you have a whole debate to talk about, and that was like an hour long. So you need to just think of which are the most important ones that will help you win. And then when you are physically writing a reply, do what works for you. You can use a table format, you could use colors, you could use like big font sizes, small font sizes. It's really up to you. Like you could do it through paper, you could do it through um typing and stuff. You could have headers. Try to figure out what note taking style well. Because if you reply, you do a lot of note taking there, right? Next, talk to your teammates. Sometimes there are probably that you are missing when you are preparing for your reply speech. Teammates will have some suggestions on what you can bring up there or what you can emphasize and be open to it as well. And lastly, listen with intent. So when you're listening to your opponents, analyze the weight of their contributions. Don't just dismiss it right away because that's also not going to be good for your team. But listen very intently to your opponents and to your teammates, to the whole debate, because that's what's going to help you have a really good reply speech as well. And that ends my lesson on providing replies. I really hope that you like that because that made me miss giving reply speeches. That is all. I'm sorry for going 20 minutes over time, but I think that ends the lesson for Debate Dojo day two in the morning. Hopefully, you guys are able to use these lessons in the future trainings and tournaments that you're gonna have. Verse and I are very happy to share all of the knowledge that we were able to acquire the many years that we had at debating. And it's nice to see like young kids like you guys. Kids, I don't know if you guys are kids, like young people like you. I hope we're still young, but like whatever. You guys have that passion for debating and have that fire for debating. And I know that because you guys have had many chances to practice and like debate is evolving even better throughout the years. You guys can be so much better than the previous generations of debaters as well. So yeah, that's it. Keep the fire burning, everybody. Thank you so much. And Verse will be seeing you for the lessons later and core debate and everything else. Just refer to your program for the exact topics. But that's all. And this has been Let Charlotte. Very nice to talk about debate again. So thank you for having me, everybody. Bye bye.